Have you ever sat by a still pond at dawn and watched the surface barely ripple, feeling the profound peace that comes from witnessing something completely at rest? Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to experience 1 billion years of such perfect stillness? Have you ever noticed how the most beautiful things in nature happen slowly? How mountains are carved grain by grain, how pearls form layer by microscopic layer. Have you ever tried to imagine the patience it would take to hold the same breath for 1 billion years? Have you ever watched the sun rise and set and wondered about all the sunrises that came before? Thousands upon thousands of identical dawns breaking over a world that never seemed to change, yet was quietly preparing for everything that would follow. Have you ever felt the deep satisfaction of a perfectly balanced moment, when everything is exactly as it should be, when there's no urgency, no crisis, just the profound contentment of existence in harmony with itself? Have you ever wondered what Earth was dreaming during its longest meditation? What visions of future forests and soaring creatures flickered through the planet's mind during 1 billion years of patient waiting? If journeys through deep time bring you the same wonder they bring me, if you find peace in these ancient memories, please consider liking and subscribing to follow along for more. And if someone you care about might appreciate drifting through Earth's memories as they drift off to sleep, why not share this gift of wonder with them? I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time you're settling in for this journey. Leave a comment below. Let me know what corner of our modern Earth you call home, and if there are other moments in deep time you'd like to explore together, other ancient memories you'd like me to share. Tell me in the comments. Your suggestions guide our future travels. But for now, let's leave the modern world behind. Settle in now. Let the weight of your day become a distant memory. Breathe in the quiet of your room, and with your exhale, let the present moment gently drift away. We are not bound by clocks or calendars tonight. Together, we will step outside of time, to a place I remember well, a world waiting in the deep past. I am the Chrononaut, and I have drifted through the ages like smoke through still air. Tonight, I invite you to join me on a journey, not forward, not back, but deeper, into the memory of Earth itself. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel yourself becoming lighter, untethered from this moment, ready to slip between the seconds and find yourself in a time before time was counted. Come with me now. Let us cross the threshold together. We are traveling back 1.5 billion years to an Earth that has found its rhythm at last. This is the middle of what your scientists call the boring billion, a name that reveals more about human expectations than about the profound beauty of this time. For this is not a boring era, but a meditation, a billion-year breath in the life of our planet, when Earth discovered the power of patience. I have come to show you that instability lies its own kind of wonder, that in repetition we find the rhythms of eternity, that in apparent sameness bloom the subtle variations that prepare the way for all complexity to come. Come, let us enter Earth's longest peace. I find myself floating above an Earth that has settled into a profound equilibrium. The violent upheavals of the planet's youth are over. The atmosphere has stabilized at a composition that will persist with only minor variations for the next billion years. Oxygen levels hover around 1 to 5%, enough to rust the land red, but not enough to support the complex life of your time. The continents have assembled into a configuration your scientists call Columbia or Nuna, though it bears no resemblance to any landmass you would recognize. This supercontinent stretches for thousands of miles, a vast expanse of rusty red rock broken by shallow seas and ancient mountain ranges worn down to gentle hills. The climate has found its balance too. Global temperatures remain steady around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, varying by only a few degrees over millions of years. There are no ice ages here, no dramatic warming events, just an endless summer that goes on and on, century after century, millennium after millennium, eon after eon. I descend to skim above the shallow seas that cover much of Earth's surface. The water is not the blue you know, but tinted purple and green by the photosynthetic bacteria that dominate these ancient oceans. These are not the oxygen-producing cyanobacteria that will later transform the world, but older lineages that harvest light without releasing that dangerous gas. The seafloor is carpeted with microbial mats, communities of bacteria living in layered harmony. From above, they look like vast underwater meadows, purple and green and orange, stretching to the horizon. But these are not plants. They are collectives of countless microscopic organisms, each layer specialized for its particular depth and light conditions. I settle onto the surface of one such mat, and immediately I am drawn into a universe of staggering complexity hidden within apparent simplicity. What seemed like a uniform surface from above reveals itself as an intricate tapestry when viewed at the molecular scale. The mat has the consistency of thick yogurt, slightly sticky, constantly growing upward as new bacteria colonize the top, while older layers are buried beneath. But this description captures only the surface of its reality. Let me take you deeper into this microbial metropolis, this bacterial city that exists in dimensions measured in millimeters, but contains stories spanning millennia. The surface is dimpled with tiny bubbles, gases produced by bacterial metabolism, mostly hydrogen, sulfide, and methane. The smell would be overwhelming to your senses, but here it is simply the breath of life, the chemical signature of 1 billion microscopic conversations. As I expand my awareness to the molecular level, the true sophistication of this bacterial community reveals itself. The mat is not a random assemblage of microbes, but a carefully structured society, as organized as any human city. The bacteria do not simply exist together. They communicate, cooperate, and coordinate their activities through an intricate network of chemical signals. At the very surface, no more than a few hundredths of an inch thick, live the photosynthetic pioneers. These cyanobacteria have positioned themselves to capture the first rays of morning sunlight, their cells packed with chlorophyll and specialized light-harvesting complexes. Each cell is a microscopic solar panel, converting photons into chemical energy with an efficiency that your best human technology struggles to match. But these surface dwellers face a deadly challenge. The oxygen they produce as a byproduct of photosynthesis is toxic to most life in this era. Watch how they solve this problem. As oxygen accumulates during the day, the cyanobacteria release chemical signals, complex organic molecules that drift through the mat like molecular messengers. These signals tell other bacteria below, oxygen coming. Prepare yourselves. Just beneath the photosynthetic layer, specialized oxygen-consuming bacteria spring into action. They possess enzymes that can safely neutralize oxygen, converting it to water while extracting energy from the reaction. It's a metabolic handshake between species, a chemical cooperation that benefits both. The photosynthesizers are protected from their own toxic waste, while the oxygen consumers gain energy from what would otherwise be poison. Descending further into the mat, I encounter layers upon layers of specialized communities, each adapted to its particular depth and chemical environment. 3 millimeters down, where only filtered sunlight penetrates, purple bacteria dominate. These organisms use a more ancient form of photosynthesis, one that doesn't produce oxygen, but instead uses hydrogen sulfide rising from below. Their world is painted in shades of purple and pink, a chromatic signature of their unique biochemistry. The purple bacteria have their own communication network. When nutrients become scarce, they release molecular distress signals, chemical SOS messages that drift through the mat. Other purple bacteria receive these signals and respond by sharing resources, transferring essential compounds through microscopic bridges that span the gaps between cells. It's a bacterial welfare system, ensuring that temporary shortages in one area don't lead to local extinction. Deeper still, in the anoxic depths of the mat where no light penetrates, I find the decomposers, bacteria that feed on the remains of their neighbors above. These organisms have evolved sophisticated molecular machinery for breaking down complex organic compounds. They secrete enzymes like microscopic workers, dismantling the molecular structures of dead cells and recycling their components. But even this decomposition is carefully orchestrated. Different species of decomposer bacteria specialize in breaking down different types of molecules. Some focus on proteins, others on lipids, still others on complex carbohydrates. They work in sequence, like an assembly line running in reverse, each species preparing materials for the next. The final products, simple compounds like ammonia, phosphate, and carbon dioxide, are released back into the mat's circulation system, ready to be captured and reused by the photosynthesizers above. The chemical communication system that coordinates this bacterial society is as sophisticated as any information network. Each species produces its own unique set of signaling molecules, chemical words in a molecular language that has evolved over millions of years. Simple molecules convey basic information. I am here. I am healthy. I am dying. More complex molecules carry detailed messages about environmental conditions, resource availability, and threats. I observe how information flows through the mat like data through your internet. A change in temperature at the surface triggers the release of temperature-sensing molecules by the cyanobacteria. These molecules diffuse downward, informing deeper communities about changing conditions above. The purple bacteria respond by adjusting their metabolism, while the decomposers alter their enzyme production. Within hours, the entire mat has adjusted to the new conditions, all through chemical signaling. The signaling system also coordinates reproduction and growth. When the mat reaches optimal thickness in one area, chemical signals suppress further growth there while promoting expansion in thinner regions. It's bacterial urban planning, ensuring efficient use of space and resources. The signals can even coordinate responses to threats. When grazers attack one area, warning molecules spread throughout the mat, triggering the production of defensive compounds and toxins. Some of the most fascinating molecular conversations occur at the boundaries between different microbial communities. Here, different species engage in what can only be called chemical negotiations. Cyanobacteria produce excess sugars during photosynthesis, but need nitrogen for growth. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria require energy-rich compounds, but can convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. At the boundary between their communities, they establish molecular trading posts, exchanging resources through carefully regulated chemical handshakes. Time moves differently in this world, and I adjust my perception to witness the grand life cycle of a single bacterial mat community. What unfolds is an epic spanning centuries, a story of growth, adaptation, decline, and renewal that plays out over scales of time that dwarf human civilization. I begin my observation with a newly formed mat, just a few bacteria thick, clinging to a rocky outcrop in shallow water. The founding population consists of perhaps 1 million cells, a mixture of photosynthesizers and decomposers that arrived as dormant spores carried by ocean currents. In the early years, growth is explosive. Each successful generation of photosynthesis adds new biomass, and the mat thickens rapidly. By year 20, the mat has grown to the thickness of a sheet of paper and covers several square yards. The simple 2-layer structure of the early years has evolved into something more complex. Competition for light has driven the evolution of specialized subcommunities. Some bacteria develop pigments that capture wavelengths others cannot use, while others learn to position themselves at optimal depths for their particular photosynthetic machinery. Year 50 marks the first major crisis. A storm deposits a layer of sediment across the mat, burying the photosynthetic surface under a blanket of mud. For months, the buried bacteria survive on stored energy and nutrients, slowly migrating upward through the sediment. Chemical signals coordinate the response. Some bacteria sacrifice themselves, releasing their stored compounds to feed the migrants, while others specialize in sediment boring, creating channels for the community to follow. The mat emerges from this burial trial more sophisticated than before. The bacteria have evolved better systems for dealing with sedimentation, including specialized cells that can rapidly digest their way through organic debris. The communication network has become more robust, capable of coordinating responses across greater distances and through physical barriers. By year 100, the mat has entered its golden age. It now covers hundreds of square yards and has developed a complex 3-dimensional structure with domes, channels, and specialized zones. The bacterial ecosystem includes dozens of species, each playing a specific role in the community's metabolism. The mat has become a coral reef of the microbial world, creating its own environmental conditions and supporting a diverse array of microscopic life. Centuries pass in slow succession. Year 200 brings a period of drought, when shallow waters recede and the mat is exposed to air for months at a time. The community survives by entering a state of suspended animation, producing protective slime layers and shutting down non-essential metabolism. When the waters return, the mat awakens like a desert after rain, blooming with renewed vigor. Year 300 sees the first appearance of what might be called bacterial parasites, microbes that have learned to exploit the mat's resources without contributing to its welfare. The community responds by evolving immune-like systems, chemical recognition networks that can identify and neutralize foreign invaders. It's an early evolutionary arms race, played out entirely at the molecular level. By year 500, the mat has become a landmark on the seafloor, visible from the surface as a dark patch beneath the purple waters. Fish-like creatures, still simple but more complex than anything seen before, begin to graze on its edges. The mat adapts by developing defensive strategies. Some areas become toxic to grazers, while others seem to welcome the disturbance, using the grazers' waste products as fertilizer. Year 700 marks the beginning of senescence. The mat has grown so thick that its lower layers are starved of light and nutrients. These deep regions begin to decay, releasing chemicals that destabilize the upper layers. The community faces a choice: continue growing and risk collapse, or find a new equilibrium. Through chemical voting, complex molecular signals that aggregate community preferences, the mat chooses stability over growth. The next 2 centuries are a time of slow decline and transformation, The mat stops growing thicker and instead spreads laterally, maintaining an optimal depth that balances resource capture with waste management. Dead zones within the mat become specialized for different functions. Some become waste processing centers. Others serve as nurseries for juvenile bacteria. The community learns to recycle itself, using decay as a resource rather than fighting it. Year 1000 brings the final crisis. Climate shifts cause ocean chemistry to change, making the waters too acidic for some of the mat's key species. Over several decades, the community restructures itself around acid-tolerant bacteria. It's a slow-motion ecological revolution, mediated entirely by chemical communication and metabolic adaptation. The mat that emerges from this transformation is smaller but more resilient, better adapted to the new conditions. As my 1,000-year observation concludes, the mat releases a massive pulse of dormant spores, its offspring dispersing to colonize new areas. The parent community enters a state of slow dissolution, its biomass becoming food for the next generation of mats, its death and birth simultaneously, the eternal cycle of bacterial reproduction scaled up to the community level. This life cycle, from founding to maturity to senescence to renewal, repeats endlessly across the sea floors of the boring billion. Each mat community is unique, shaped by its particular history and environment, yet all follow similar patterns of growth, adaptation, and transformation. They are the protagonists of Earth's longest-running story, patient actors in a drama measured in geological time. Time moves differently in this world. I watch a patch of mat for what would be a human lifetime. It grows perhaps 6 inches taller, layer upon layer of bacteria living, dying, and being compressed into thin sheets of organic matter. Storms come and go, depositing layers of sediment that the bacteria quickly colonize. The pattern repeats endlessly: growth, burial, regrowth. But now you understand the hidden complexity within that simple pattern. The molecular conversations, the chemical cooperation, the 1,000-year life cycles that transform apparent simplicity into staggering sophistication. This is the rhythm of the boring billion. Not dramatic change, but patient accumulation. These mats are building the future limestone deposits that will lock away carbon for hundreds of millions of years. They are creating the first true soils as their remains mix with weathered rock. They are slowly, imperceptibly, preparing the stage for the complexity to come. To truly comprehend what we are witnessing, we must expand our awareness across multiple scales of time and space. Let me take you on a journey through the nested hierarchies of existence during the boring billion. From the quantum dance of electrons in bacterial photosynthesis to the galactic context of Earth's long meditation. At the molecular scale, time moves in femtoseconds and picoseconds. I observe a single chlorophyll molecule as it captures a photon of sunlight. The energy transfer happens in less than a trillionth of a second. An electron jumps to a higher energy state, beginning the cascade of reactions that will convert light into chemical energy. This quantum event, lasting an infinitesimal fraction of a second, is repeated quintillions of times every second across the bacterial mats of Earth. Zooming out to the cellular scale, time is measured in minutes and hours. A single cyanobacterium completes its entire life cycle: growth, photosynthesis, reproduction, death, in perhaps a day. Yet this brief existence is part of a chain that stretches across geological time. The bacterium that lives and dies in a single day participates in processes that have continued unchanged for millions of years and will continue for millions more. At the ecosystem scale, time flows in seasons and centuries. I observed the slow development of a stromatolite community over decades, watching as storm damage is repaired, as species composition gradually shifts, as the structure grows imperceptibly taller. Each century brings changes barely visible to the casual observer, yet over millions of centuries, entire reef systems rise from the seafloor. Expanding to the planetary scale, time moves in millions and billions of years. From this perspective, the entire boring billion is a single chapter in Earth's story. A long, slow breath between the chaos of early formation and the explosion of complex life. The patient work of bacteria transforms atmospheric composition, ocean chemistry, and continental surfaces in changes visible only over geological epochs. At the galactic scale, Earth itself is a tiny speck orbiting an ordinary star in the outer reaches of the Milky Way. During the boring billion, our solar system completes nearly 4 complete orbits around the galactic center, a journey of incredible distance that takes 250 million years per orbit. The bacterial mats we observe exist in this vast cosmic context, their patient work unfolding against the backdrop of stellar birth and death, galactic rotation, and the slow evolution of the universe itself. Let me help you grasp the true scale of a billion years by breaking it into comprehensible units. If each second of the boring billion were a single heartbeat, this era would contain more heartbeats than have ever beaten in the chests of all humans who have ever lived, and then millions of times more. If each year of the boring billion were a single day, this era would last nearly 3 million human days, longer than recorded human history. If each millennium were reduced to a single minute, the boring billion would last nearly 2,000 years. Consider this: every human civilization, every empire that has risen and fallen, every technological advance from the first stone tools to space exploration, all of human history spans less than 10,000 years. The boring billion is 100,000 times longer than all of human history. It is longer than the age of complex animals, longer than the existence of land plants, longer than the formation of the continents as we know them. In this vast span of time, the bacteria we observe have the luxury of true patience. They can afford to spend 1,000,000 years perfecting a single metabolic pathway. They can take 10 million years to adapt to a minor environmental change. They can invest 100 million years in building cooperative relationships with other species. Time for them is not a scarce resource, but an abundant gift that allows for thoroughness impossible in shorter timescales. Within the apparent uniformity of the boring billion, I can discern distinct phases, each lasting hundreds of millions of years, each with its own character and contributions to Earth's development. The early boring billion, 1.8 to 1.5 billion years ago, is the era of establishment. This is when the basic patterns of the stable world are set in place. Stromatolite communities reach their peak diversity and distribution. Purple bacteria achieve their maximum dominance of marine ecosystems. The iron formations that will become the foundation of future civilizations are deposited. It's a time of reaching equilibrium, of finding the stable patterns that will persist for eons. The middle boring billion, 1.5 to 1.2 billion years ago, is the era of refinement. The basic structures and processes established in the early phase are optimized and perfected. Bacterial metabolism becomes extraordinarily efficient. Chemical cycles achieve remarkable stability. The first tentative experiments with cellular complexity begin, though they remain rare and fragile. This is evolution in its most patient mode, polishing and perfecting rather than innovating. The late boring billion, 1.2 to 0.8 billion years ago, is the era of preparation. While surface conditions remain stable, fundamental changes are accumulating beneath the apparent stillness. Oxygen levels begin their slow but inexorable rise. The first eukaryotic cells appear and begin to diversify. The chemical and biological foundations for complex life are quietly put in place. It's a time of hidden transformation, when the seeds of future complexity are planted in the stable soil of the bacterial world. Each phase lasts longer than all complex life has existed on Earth, yet each has its own distinct character and role in the larger story. Together, they form a symphony in 3 movements, each building upon the last, each preparing for the dramatic changes to come. I drift along the coastline where land meets sea. The shores are unlike anything in your world. No waves crash here, for the moon is closer and the tides are gentler, but more frequent. Every 6 hours, the water rises and falls in a smooth, predictable rhythm. The intertidal zone is colonized by specialized mats that can survive both submersion and exposure. The land itself is barren by your standards, but not lifeless. Bacterial colonies coat every damp surface. In the morning, when dew condenses on the rocks, they spring to metabolic life. By noon, as the moisture evaporates, they shut down, waiting patiently for the next wetting. Some can survive months or even years of drought, reviving within minutes when water returns. I follow a small stream inland, one of countless waterways that drain the ancient continent. The stream bed is lined with more microbial mats. These adapted to freshwater conditions. They form thick, rubbery sheets that can be peeled up like carpet. Beneath them, the rock is etched with the acids they produce, slowly dissolving minerals that will eventually reach the sea. The stream leads to a lake, one of thousands that dot the continental interior. The lake is shallow, no more than 30 feet at its deepest, and its waters are stratified into distinct layers. The surface water, rich in oxygen from photosynthesis, supports one community of microbes. Below, where oxygen cannot penetrate, entirely different organisms thrive in the anoxic darkness. I dive through these layers, each with its own chemical signature, its own microscopic inhabitants. At the bottom, in the mud, I find something remarkable. Tiny crystals of gypsum and other minerals, precipitating from the concentrated waters. These lakes are chemical laboratories, concentrating elements that are scarce in the oceans. Over millions of years, as lakes evaporate and refill, they create deposits of salts and minerals that will be crucial resources for future life. But the true wonders of this era are the stromatolites, layered structures built by cyanobacteria in shallow waters. I position myself in a lagoon where thousands of these structures rise from the seafloor like miniature mountains. Each one is a living building, constructed over centuries by countless generations of bacteria. I examine a stromatolite closely. It's about 3 feet tall, with a dome top covered in a thin layer of living bacteria. These cyanobacteria are different from their purple cousins. They use water in photosynthesis, splitting it to release oxygen. But in this low oxygen world, that oxygen is immediately consumed by chemical reactions or by other bacteria. It will take hundreds of millions of years of this patient work before free oxygen can accumulate in the atmosphere. The stromatolite grows so slowly that its progress is invisible even to my time-expanded perception. A thin layer of bacteria photosynthesize during the day, building their bodies from carbon dioxide and water. At night, or when storms bring sediment, they secrete sticky substances that trap particles. Gradually, they migrate upward, leaving behind a thin layer of limestone infiltrated with organic matter. Layer by layer, year by year, century by century, the stromatolite builds. Each layer is less than a millimeter thick, yet over millions of years, some stromatolites will grow to be hundreds of feet tall. They are patient architects, building monuments that will outlast mountain ranges. I spend years observing the daily cycle of a stromatolite community. Dawn brings a surge of photosynthetic activity as the bacteria harvest the first light. By midday, oxygen bubbles rise from the mat like champagne. In the afternoon, other bacteria move to the surface, harvesting the waste products of the photosynthesizers. At night, yet another shift occurs as bacteria that can live without oxygen take over. It's a complex dance of cooperation and competition, played out on a microscopic scale, but repeated across millions of square miles of shallow sea floor. The stromatolites are cities in their own right, with different species occupying different niches, recycling nutrients with an efficiency that human cities can only dream of. What strikes me most about this world is its stability. The same patterns repeat everywhere I look. Stromatolites in Australia look identical to those in North America. Microbial mats follow the same layering patterns, whether they're in fresh water or marine environments. It's as if life has found a formula that works and sees no need to change it. This is the establishment of Earth's first true biosphere. Not the chaotic experimentation of earlier eras, but a stable, self-regulating system. The bacteria have learned to cooperate on a global scale, maintaining chemical cycles that keep the environment suitable for life. Carbon is fixed by photosynthesis and buried in sediments. Nitrogen is converted between its various forms. Sulfur cycles between ocean and atmosphere. It's a planetary metabolism, breathing with a rhythm measured in millions of years. As I contemplate this stable world, I understand why it will persist for so long. There are no predators here to drive evolutionary arms races, no complex organisms to create new ecological niches, no dramatic environmental changes to force adaptation. Life has found a comfortable equilibrium and settled into it like a cat in a sunbeam. Yet even in this stability, subtle changes are occurring. Each stromatolite is slightly different from its neighbors. Some bacteria develop minor improvements in photosynthesis. Others become better at surviving dry periods. These tiny innovations accumulate like interest in a savings account, too slowly to notice but building towards something profound. The boring billion is not a pause in Earth's story, but a long, deep breath. A time of preparation, a gathering of resources and possibilities that will, in time, enable the explosion of complexity that follows. But for now, there is only the patient rhythm of growth and burial, photosynthesis and respiration, tide and evaporation. Earth has become a meditation, and I settle in to observe its breathing. A billion-year biography. Before we explore the great stromatolite cities, let me share with you the intimate biography of a single bacterial community. One small mat that I have chosen to follow through the entirety of the boring billion. I call it Prometheus Mat, for like the mythical Titan who brought fire to humanity, this small community will kindle innovations that light the way for all future life. Come with me to a shallow bay in what will one day be called Western Australia. The water here is warm, clear, and rich, with the minerals that bacterial life craves. It is here, 1.8 billion years ago, that our story begins. Not with drama, but with the quiet arrival of a few dozen dormant spores carried by currents from some distant mat that has chosen this moment to reproduce. The spores settle onto a patch of sandy sea floor, no larger than your dining table. The conditions are perfect. Water depth of exactly 4 feet, optimal for photosynthesis, but deep enough to prevent desiccation during low tides. The substrate is neither too soft nor too hard, providing stability without impeding root-like structures. Within days of settling, the spores sense their environment and begin to awaken. Chemical sensors embedded in their protective coats detect the right balance of nutrients, the correct temperature, the appropriate pH. One by one, they shed their dormant state and begin to grow. But they do not grow as isolated individuals. From the very beginning, they communicate, sharing information about local conditions and coordinating their development. The first year sees explosive but carefully organized growth. Cyanobacteria establish themselves at the surface, immediately beginning to photosynthesize and produce oxygen. But they do not work alone. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria position themselves in the spaces between cyanobacterial colonies, providing essential nutrients. Decomposer bacteria establish themselves in the lower layers, preparing to recycle the inevitable casualties of this new community. By the end of year 1, Prometheus mat covers an area the size of a bathtub and has achieved a thickness of nearly ½ an inch. To bacteria, this represents a major metropolitan area. Millions of individuals organized into specialized districts, connected by chemical communication networks, and beginning to create their own localized environment. The first 100 years of Prometheus mat are years of experimentation and optimization. The community tries different organizational structures, different metabolic partnerships, different responses to environmental challenges. It's like a city finding its character, establishing the traditions and systems that will define it for millennia to come. Year 23 brings the first major crisis, a severe storm that dumps a thick layer of sediment across the entire mat. For months, the photosynthetic surface is buried in darkness. Many communities would die, but Prometheus mat has been preparing for such challenges. Stored nutrients are carefully rationed and distributed. Specialized bacteria begin the slow work of digesting through the sediment blanket. Most remarkably, some bacteria sacrifice themselves, releasing their cellular contents to feed the essential photosynthesizers until they can reach light again. The mat emerges from this burial trial changed. The near-death experience has forged stronger cooperative bonds. The chemical communication system has evolved greater sophistication, capable of coordinating responses across the entire community. New metabolic partnerships have formed. Bacteria that proved essential during the crisis are now permanent members of the community. Year 47 sees the first major innovation. Some cyanobacteria in the mat evolve improved light harvesting complexes, able to capture wavelengths that others cannot use. This allows denser packing of photosynthetic bacteria without competition, increasing the mat's overall productivity. The innovation spreads through horizontal gene transfer, but gradually, the community somehow regulates the pace of change, ensuring stability while allowing improvement. By year 62, Prometheus mat has developed its first truly distinctive characteristic, specialized channels that transport nutrients and waste products throughout the community with remarkable efficiency. These channels, carved by specialized bacteria, create a circulatory system that allows the mat to grow much thicker than its neighbors, while maintaining all layers in good health. Year 79 brings contact with other mats. The expanding edges of Prometheus mat encounter the boundaries of neighboring communities. Rather than competition, this leads to cooperation. Chemical negotiations result in the establishment of shared border zones where different mats exchange genetic material, nutrients, and information about environmental conditions. As the first century concludes, Prometheus mat has grown to cover several square yards and has achieved a thickness of nearly 4 inches. More importantly, it has established the organizational principles that will guide its development for the next billion years. Cooperative metabolism, sophisticated communication, adaptive flexibility, and careful regulation of change. The first 1,000 years of Prometheus mat's existence are marked by increasingly sophisticated environmental engineering. The mat doesn't simply adapt to its environment, it begins to actively modify conditions to suit its needs. Year 203 sees the development of chemical weather prediction. Bacteria in the mat evolve the ability to sense minute changes in water chemistry that precede seasonal storms. This early warning system allows the entire community to prepare, strengthening protective slime layers, adjusting metabolic activity, and positioning resources where they'll be most needed. By year 347, the mat has learned to influence local water circulation. The pattern of its growth creates subtle currents that bring fresh nutrients while carrying away waste products. It's environmental engineering at the microbial scale, but the effects are profound. Prometheus mat can now support a much larger population than similar mats in less optimized locations. Year 456 marks the first appearance of defensive systems. As grazing organisms become more common, parts of the mat begin producing chemical deterrents, compounds that make their tissues toxic or unpalatable to potential predators. But the mat is clever about this. Only some areas become defensive, while others remain palatable, effectively training grazers to feed only in designated zones where their waste products are most beneficial. The mat's most remarkable innovation appears in year 678, the development of seasonal metabolic cycles that anticipate environmental changes months in advance. During the calm season, the mat stores excess resources in specialized bacterial granules. As storms approach, it shifts metabolism to prioritize survival over growth. It's learned to breathe with the rhythm of the seasons, expanding and contracting its activity to match environmental cycles. By year 834, Prometheus mat has become a local landmark. Other mats in the area have begun copying its innovations, creating a regional ecosystem of increasingly sophisticated microbial communities. The mat has transcended its own boundaries, becoming a teacher and influencer in the larger community of life. As Prometheus mat enters its second millennium, it has evolved from a simple bacterial community into something approaching a complex ecosystem. The mat now hosts dozens of different bacterial species, each playing specialized roles in an intricate web of cooperation and interdependence. Year 1247 sees the arrival of the first permanent residents that are not bacteria. Tiny protist-like organisms that have evolved to live exclusively within the mat's protective matrix. These early eukaryotic cells serve as mobile agents, carrying chemical signals between distant parts of the mat and helping to coordinate community-wide responses to changing conditions. The mat's internal architecture becomes increasingly sophisticated. By year 2156, it has developed distinct zones with different functions: photosynthetic penthouse districts at the surface, manufacturing zones in the middle layers where complex organic compounds are synthesized, waste processing facilities in the deeper regions, and specialized residential areas where different species can maintain their preferred conditions. Year 3445 brings the evolution of memory systems. The mat develops the ability to remember past environmental challenges and prepare for their return. This is accomplished through epigenetic modifications, chemical tags attached to genes that can be maintained for generations, carrying information about past experiences forward in time. The mat literally learns from its history. By year 5678, Prometheus mat has become a center of innovation for the entire region. New metabolic strategies, defensive compounds, and organizational structures evolve within its protective environment and then spread to other communities through a process resembling cultural transmission. The mat has become not just a participant in evolution, but a driver of evolutionary change. Year 7890 marks the development of long-distance chemical communication. The mat evolves the ability to release specific molecular signals that can be detected by other mats miles away. This allows coordination of reproductive cycles, sharing of information about environmental threats, and even coordinated responses to regional challenges. Prometheus mat has become part of a communication network spanning the entire shallow sea ecosystem. As Prometheus mat approaches its 100,000th birthday, it has become the center of a vast microbial civilization. The innovations developed within its boundaries have spread throughout the region, creating an interconnected network of sophisticated bacterial communities. Year 23,456 sees the mat's most ambitious engineering project: the construction of elevated growth platforms that rise several feet above the surrounding sea floor. These structures, built from precipitated minerals and bacterial polymers, create new habitats with optimal light exposure, while providing protection from bottom-dwelling grazers. It's architecture at the microbial scale, but architecture nonetheless. The mat's influence on regional geology becomes apparent by year 45,673. The constant precipitation of minerals by its bacterial inhabitants has created distinctive rock formations that will persist for millions of years. Prometheus mat is not just living in its environment, it's creating permanent changes that will influence the evolution of future life. Year 67,891 brings the first successful experiments with multicellular organization. Some bacteria within the mat begin forming permanent aggregations, with individual cells specializing for different functions within the group. It's a tentative step toward true multicellularity, one that won't be fully realized for hundreds of millions of years, but the first experiments occur here, in the innovative environment of Prometheus mat. By year 89,234, the mat has developed something resembling a primitive immune system. It can recognize and respond to threats not just through chemical deterrence, but through coordinated community responses. When pathogens attack, the mat can isolate infected areas, boost defensive measures in surrounding regions, and even recruit help from allied bacterial communities. As Prometheus mat celebrates its millionth anniversary, it has transformed from a small biological community into a geological force. Its activities have reshaped the local landscape, created new mineral deposits, and influenced the evolution of life across thousands of square miles. Year 234,567 marks the completion of the mat's greatest engineering achievement: a system of channels and barriers that controls water flow across the entire shallow bay. These structures, built from bacterial concrete and reinforced with precipitated minerals, create optimal conditions for photosynthesis while protecting against storm damage. The mat has become a landscape architect, redesigning its environment on a scale that rivals human engineering projects. The mat's biological innovations continue to accelerate. Year 456,789 sees the evolution of the first bacteria capable of using atmospheric nitrogen directly, without the energy-expensive process of nitrogen fixation. This breakthrough allows the mat to thrive in nutrient-poor conditions and spreads rapidly to other communities, transforming the nitrogen cycle throughout the region. By year 6,789,000, Prometheus mat has achieved something unprecedented: the ability to actively modify its own evolution. Through sophisticated regulatory networks, the mat can control the rate of genetic change, speeding up innovation when needed and slowing it down during stable periods. It's evolution managing evolution, a level of self-awareness that won't be seen again until the emergence of human civilization. Year 891,234 brings the mat's most philosophical achievement: the development of something resembling cultural transmission. Innovations and strategies developed by one part of the mat can be learned and adopted by other parts, not through genetic inheritance, but through chemical education. The mat has developed the bacterial equivalent of culture, complete with teaching, learning, and the preservation of knowledge across generations. As Prometheus mat enters its second and third 100 million years, it transitions from an innovator to a guardian, maintaining stability in an increasingly complex and interconnected ecosystem, while continuing to refine and perfect the innovations of its youth. The mat becomes a living library, preserving genetic and chemical information about past environmental conditions. By year 456,789,012,000, its deeper layers contain a record of climate changes, chemical variations, and biological innovations spanning hundreds of millions of years. Future organisms will be able to read this bacterial archive like a history book written in limestone and organic compounds. Prometheus mat's influence on global systems becomes apparent during the great oxygenation events of the middle boring billion. The oxygen-producing innovations first developed within its boundaries have spread worldwide, contributing to the slow but steady increase in atmospheric oxygen that will eventually make complex life possible. By year 678,901,234, the mat has achieved something like immortality. Individual bacteria are born, live, and die in cycles measured in hours or days, but the community itself has developed such sophisticated repair and renewal mechanisms that it could theoretically persist indefinitely. It has become a sort of bacterial ship of Theseus, constantly replacing its parts while maintaining its essential identity. As the boring billion draws toward its close, and the first eukaryotic cells begin to challenge bacterial dominance, Prometheus mat faces its greatest test. The stable world it has helped create and maintain for nearly 1 billion years is beginning to change. And change threatens everything it has built. Year 945,678,901 brings the first eukaryotic grazers to Prometheus mat's ecosystem. These new organisms can digest bacterial communities with unprecedented efficiency, and they pose an existential threat to the mat's way of life. But true to its innovative heritage, the mat adapts, developing new defensive strategies, forming partnerships with some eukaryotes while deterring others, and even beginning to incorporate eukaryotic cells into its own community structure. The mat's final innovation, occurring in year 9,876,543,201, may be its most important. The development of dormancy systems that can preserve the mat's essential characteristics through periods of dramatic environmental change. As the world transforms around it, Prometheus mat learns to enter a state of suspended animation, waiting for conditions to stabilize before resuming active growth. As our billion-year biography concludes, Prometheus Mat has achieved something remarkable. It has not only survived Earth's longest period of stability, but has actively helped create and maintain that stability. From its humble beginnings as a few dozen bacterial spores, it has grown into a geological and biological force that has influenced the evolution of life on a planetary scale. The innovations first developed within Prometheus Mat: sophisticated cellular communication, cooperative metabolism, environmental engineering, and adaptive flexibility, have become the foundations of all complex life. When eukaryotic cells eventually evolve true multicellularity, they will use principles first explored by bacterial mats like Prometheus. When complex ecosystems develop, they will rely on the same cooperative strategies that Prometheus Mat perfected over hundreds of millions of years. Prometheus Mat teaches us that significance is not measured by size or complexity, but by influence and persistence. This small bacterial community, never larger than a football field, has contributed more to the history of life than countless larger organisms. It shows us that innovation often comes from the margins, that cooperation can be more powerful than competition, and that true success is measured not in years, but in eons. As I prepare to leave Prometheus Mat after witnessing its billion-year story, I'm struck by the profound patience it has demonstrated. Every innovation took millions of years to perfect. Every adaptation required countless generations of trial and error. Every success built upon hundreds of millions of years of previous development. Yet the mat never hurried, never compromised quality for speed, never abandoned its fundamental principles in pursuit of short-term advantage. Prometheus Mat embodies the essential spirit of the boring billion. The understanding that true transformation requires not dramatic gestures, but patient, persistent work. It shows us that the greatest achievements in the history of life have come not from sudden inspiration, but from the accumulation of countless small improvements over unimaginable spans of time. And so our billion-year biography concludes, not with an ending, but with a transition. As the boring billion gives way to more dynamic eras, Prometheus Mat and communities like it will continue to evolve, adapt, and innovate. They will provide the stable foundation upon which all future complexity will be built. They are the true heroes of deep time, the patient gardeners who prepared Earth for the spectacular life to come. 500 million years into the boring billion, I find myself exploring what can only be called cities. Not of creatures like those in your time, but cities nonetheless. The Stromatolite reefs have grown into vast underwater metropolises, some covering thousands of square miles, creating their own geography on the shallow sea floor. I approach one such reef complex in what will one day be Western Australia. From a distance, it looks like a submerged mountain range with peaks and valleys, ridges and canyons. But as I draw closer, I see that every surface is alive, covered with the thin biofilms of photosynthetic bacteria that build these structures one microscopic layer at a time. The diversity of forms is remarkable. Some stromatolites grow as simple domes, like giant bacterial bubbles frozen in stone. Others branch and merge, creating structures that resemble enormous cauliflowers. Still others form flat platforms that extend for miles, raised just inches above the surrounding sea floor, but representing millions of years of patient growth. I settle onto one of these platforms to observe the daily life of the reef. The water here is crystal clear, only 10 feet deep, warmed by the tropical sun to a constant 88 degrees. Perfect conditions for photosynthesis. As the morning light strengthens, the entire platform seems to exhale, releasing streams of tiny oxygen bubbles that rise like inverse rain. But this oxygen doesn't accumulate. I watch as it's immediately consumed by other bacteria living in the spaces between stromatolites. These organisms can't photosynthesize, but they've learned to harvest the energy released when oxygen reacts with iron, sulfur, and organic matter. They form rust-colored films on any surface not dominated by the photosynthesizers, creating a patchwork of green and orange across the reef. The architecture of the reef creates countless microenvironments. In the shallow pools that form between stromatolite domes, the water can heat to over 100 degrees at midday. Only the most heat-tolerant bacteria survive here, forming thick mats that are almost black with protective pigments. At night, when the water cools, different species emerge from dormancy, taking advantage of the nutrients concentrated by evaporation. Deeper channels between the structures harbor different communities entirely. Here, where water flow is stronger, bacteria have evolved to form tough, leathery mats that can withstand currents. They anchor themselves with microscopic holdfasts, creating living carpets that ripple in the flow like alien kelp forests. I follow one such channel as it winds through the reef. The walls on either side are layered like geological strata, each band representing a period of growth under slightly different conditions. A darker layer might indicate a storm that brought iron-rich sediment. A lighter band could mark a season of exceptional growth. Together, they form a history book, written in stone and bacteria, recording millions of years of local conditions. The stromatolites are not passive structures, but dynamic ecosystems. I observe how they respond to changing conditions throughout the day. As the tide rises, bringing cooler, nutrient-rich water from the deeper ocean, metabolic activity surges. The photosynthesizers adjust their position, migrating upward through the biofilm to maintain optimal light exposure. Other bacteria retreat deeper, avoiding the oxygen-rich surface waters. When clouds pass overhead, temporarily dimming the light, the entire community shifts its metabolism within minutes. Photosynthesis slows, oxygen production drops, and bacteria that prefer lower light levels become more active. It's like watching a city dim its lights and change its rhythm as day turns to evening, but happening in response to every passing cloud. The boundaries between individual stromatolites are particularly interesting. Where two growing structures meet, they don't simply collide. Instead, they negotiate a border through chemical signaling. Each stromatolite maintains its own distinct bacterial community, slightly different from its neighbors. At the boundaries, hybrid zones form where bacteria from both communities intermingle, sometimes creating entirely new metabolic partnerships. I spend months observing one such boundary zone. The bacteria here engage in what can only be called trade, exchanging nutrients and metabolic products across the frontier. Photosynthesizers from one stromatolite provide sugars to nitrogen-fixing bacteria from another. In return, they receive nitrogen compounds essential for growth. It's a microbial economy, with exchange rates determined by supply and demand. The stromatolite cities are also recycling centers of extraordinary efficiency. Nothing is wasted here. When bacteria die, their bodies are immediately consumed by others. The breakdown products are absorbed and reused. Even the waste products of one species become resources for another. Sulfur cycles through dozens of forms, each transformation performed by specialized bacteria. Carbon is fixed, released, and fixed again in endless cycles. I discover that the reefs create their own weather patterns. During the day, as photosynthesis pumps oxygen into the water, the surface becomes supersaturated. Tiny bubbles form on every available surface, growing until they break free and rise. This creates microcurrents that bring nutrients up from deeper water. It's like a very slow, very gentle fountain, powered entirely by bacterial metabolism. At night, the pattern reverses. Without photosynthesis, oxygen levels drop. Different bacteria take over, some producing hydrogen sulfide, others methane. These gases also bubble up, but more slowly, creating a different pattern of currents. The reef breathes in and out with a daily rhythm that has persisted for millions of years. The longevity of individual stromatolites is staggering. I identify one large dome that I estimate to be over 10 million years old. That's 10 million years of continuous growth, continuous life, in the same spot. Empires of bacteria have risen and fallen on its surface. Countless generations have lived and died, yet the structure persists, growing imperceptibly taller with each passing millennium. To put this in perspective, this single stromatolite has existed for longer than the entire age of mammals in your time. It was already ancient when the first complex animals appeared. It will continue growing for hundreds of millions of years more. In the life of a stromatolite, the entire history of human civilization is less than a single layer of growth. The stromatolite cities are also libraries, storing information about Earth's history in their layers. Changes in ocean chemistry are recorded in the minerals that precipitate. Variations in growth rate reflect ancient climate patterns. Even the DNA of bacteria trapped in the layers preserves a genetic record of how life evolved during the boring billion. I observe how new stromatolites form. It starts with a small irregularity on the sea floor, perhaps a shell fragment or a pebble. Bacteria colonize this hard surface, beginning to trap sediment and precipitate minerals. Within decades, a small bump appears. Within centuries, a recognizable dome. Within millennia, a structure that rises feet above the surrounding sea floor. The growth is so slow that it's difficult to perceive even with my ability to compress time. A stromatolite growing at typical rates would take 1,000 years to grow an inch. Yet they persist, patient as stones, building their bacterial mountains one microscopic layer at a time. But the stromatolites are not alone in these shallow seas. Between the reefs, other forms of bacterial life flourish. I find vast plains covered with what look like purple carpets, actually dense communities of purple sulfur bacteria. These organisms use a more primitive form of photosynthesis that doesn't produce oxygen. They've persisted from Earth's earlier eras, finding niches where they can avoid competition with the more efficient cyanobacteria. In deeper water, where less light penetrates, I discover bacterial communities that have given up on photosynthesis entirely. They cluster around areas where reduced chemicals seep from the seafloor. Hydrogen sulfide, methane, ammonia. Using these chemicals as energy sources, they build their own versions of reefs, though smaller and growing even more slowly than the stromatolites. The stromatolite cities represent life at its most patient, most persistent. They are monuments to the power of cooperation, to the strength found in stability. Each reef is a trillion bacteria working together, building something that will outlast them all. As I drift above these ancient cities, watching their slow breath of oxygen and other gases, I'm struck by how different this world is from the one you know. There's no competition here as you would recognize it. No predation. No race to grow faster or reproduce quicker. Just patient accumulation, endless cooperation, and the slow transformation of sunlight into stone. The stromatolite cities are preparing Earth's future, though they cannot know it. The oxygen they produce even though it's immediately consumed, is slowly oxidizing the planet. The carbon they bury is gradually changing atmospheric composition. The minerals they precipitate are creating new types of rock. They are terraforming Earth in the truest sense, making it ready for the complex life that will eventually arise. But that's still far in the future. For now, there are only the cities of bacteria, growing with infinite patience beneath the purple seas. As I expand my awareness to encompass the entire planet during this boring billion, I'm struck by the colors. This is not the blue and green Earth you know, but a world painted in purples, reds, and oranges. The dominant photosynthesizers of this era use different pigments than modern plants, creating a landscape that would seem utterly alien to your eyes. I position myself high in the atmosphere, looking down at the planet spread below. The continents are rusty red, stained by iron oxides formed when the limited atmospheric oxygen reacts with iron-bearing rocks. But it's the oceans that truly capture attention. Instead of blue, vast areas are tinted purple by the photosynthetic bacteria that dominate the surface waters. These purple bacteria use a more ancient form of photosynthesis than the oxygen-producing cyanobacteria. They capture light using pigments called bacteria chlorophylls, which absorb different wavelengths than the chlorophyll in modern plants. The result is a purple tint that can range from lavender in areas of moderate growth to deep violet where the bacteria are especially dense. I descend to sea level to observe these purple oceans more closely. The color is not uniform, but shifts with depth and density of bacteria. In the open ocean, where nutrients are scarce, the purple is pale, almost translucent. Near coastlines, where runoff from land brings minerals, the color deepens to wine-dark hues that would have delighted Homer. The purple bacteria have advantages in this low oxygen world. They don't produce oxygen as a waste product, avoiding the toxic effects that limit cyanobacteria. They can use a wider variety of electron donors for photosynthesis. Not just water, but hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen gas, even organic compounds. This flexibility allows them to dominate environments where cyanobacteria struggle. I follow ocean currents as they carry communities of purple bacteria across the globe. These microscopic organisms drift in numbers beyond counting, turning entire seas purple with their presence. When they die, they rain down through the water column like purple snow, carrying organic matter to the depths. But the purple bacteria are not uniform. I identified dozens of different species, each with slightly different pigments, slightly different preferences. Some thrive in cooler waters, others in warm. Some prefer high light, others function better in dimmer conditions. Together, they form a purple patchwork across the oceans, each patch representing different environmental conditions. In shallow lagoons and protected bays, the purple gives way to other colors. Here, where conditions are more variable, different types of photosynthetic bacteria compete for space. Green sulfur bacteria form emerald patches, where hydrogen sulfide is abundant. Orange carotenoid-producing bacteria colonize the hottest areas. The result is a living palette that shifts with seasons and tides. I discover that the purple earth extends beyond the oceans. On land, in areas where water collects, purple bacteria form extensive mats. After rain, temporary pools bloom purple within days as dormant cells spring to life. These pools might last only weeks before evaporating, but that's enough time for the bacteria to grow, reproduce, and form resistant spores that will wait for the next rain. The purple bacteria have even colonized hot springs, though here they face competition from other thermophilic organisms. I observe a hot spring where the water emerges at near boiling temperatures. The immediate area is colonized by clear or pale yellow bacteria that can withstand the heat. But as the water flows away and cools, purple bacteria take over, forming vivid violet streams that snake across the landscape. The dominance of purple photosynthesizers has profound effects on Earth's climate. These bacteria absorb different wavelengths of light than oxygen-producing cyanobacteria or modern plants. This changes the planet's albedo. How much light is reflected back to space? The purple Earth absorbs more infrared radiation, helping maintain the stable warm temperatures of the boring billion. I observe how this affects local weather patterns. Above purple seas, the air warms differently than it would above blue water. This creates unique patterns of convection, driving winds that follow different paths than on modern Earth. Storms form in different places. Rain falls in different patterns. The purple bacteria are not just passengers on Earth, but active participants in shaping its climate. The biochemistry of the purple Earth is equally distinctive. Without significant oxygen production, different chemical cycles dominate. Sulfur plays a much larger role, cycling between various oxidation states as different bacteria transform it. The smell of hydrogen sulfide and other reduced sulfur compounds permeates the atmosphere, creating an olfactory landscape completely foreign to your experience. I follow the sulfur cycle through its various transformations. Purple sulfur bacteria use hydrogen sulfide as an electron donor, converting it to elemental sulfur, which they store as granules inside their cells. When they die, this sulfur is released and settles to the seafloor. There, other bacteria convert it back to hydrogen sulfide, completing the cycle. It's a sulfur-based economy, as complex as the carbon cycle of your time, but following different rules. The purple bacteria also interact with the limited oxygen produced by cyanobacteria in interesting ways. I observe boundary zones where purple bacteria and cyanobacteria meet. During the day, cyanobacteria produce oxygen, creating a toxic environment for the purple bacteria, which retreat to deeper water or enter dormancy. At night, when photosynthesis stops and oxygen is consumed, the purple bacteria return, reclaiming their territory. It's a daily dance of advance and retreat, played out across millions of square miles. The longevity of purple domination is remarkable. For hundreds of millions of years, these bacteria maintain their supremacy in the oceans. Generations beyond counting live and die, yet the purple persists. It's a stable state, resistant to change. The purple bacteria have found a formula for success and see no need to alter it. But I notice subtle variations over geological time. During periods when volcanic activity increases, adding iron and other nutrients to the oceans, the purple deepens and spreads. When volcanism wanes and nutrients become scarce, the purple fades and retreats. These cycles play out over millions of years, like very slow breathing. The purple Earth also preserves differently than the modern world. When purple bacteria die and sink into anoxic waters, their pigments break down into distinctive compounds. These biological markers, or biomarkers, will persist in rocks for billions of years, allowing future scientists to detect the presence of ancient purple bacteria, even when no other traces remain. I examine sediments forming in a deep basin where purple bacteria accumulate. Layer after layer of purple-tinted organic matter settles, compressed by its own weight. Over millions of years, this will become oil shale, locking away vast amounts of carbon. The purple bacteria are thus preparing energy reserves that won't be tapped for more than 1 billion years. The stability of the purple Earth is both its strength and its limitation. The purple bacteria have optimized their metabolism for a low oxygen world. They've filled every available niche, from surface waters to hot springs to temporary pools. But this very success makes them vulnerable to change. They're so well adapted to current conditions that they have little evolutionary flexibility. As I contemplate the purple Earth, I'm reminded that this too is a valid way for a planet to be. There's no inherent superiority in the blue and green Earth of your time. The purple Earth is complete in itself, a functioning biosphere that could, in principle, persist indefinitely. It's only the slow accumulation of oxygen, molecule by molecule, that will eventually doom this purple world. But that doom is still far in the future. For now, the purple Earth continues its patient existence. Purple waves lap purple shores under skies tinged with purple haze. Purple rains fall from purple clouds, feeding purple streams that flow to purple seas. It's a monochrome world by your standards, but within that purple are infinite subtle variations, each telling its own story of adaptation and survival. The purple Earth is a reminder that life can take many forms, paint the world in many colors. What seems alien and wrong to eyes adapted to one set of conditions may be perfectly natural, even inevitable, under different circumstances. The purple bacteria are not a failed experiment or a primitive precursor. They are life finding its own way, creating its own beauty in the conditions they inherited. The boring billion is not boring at all. It's a purple meditation, a billion-year exploration of what it means to be alive on a planet where oxygen is poison and purple is the color of success. The 500 million year journey to breathable air. Now I must tell you of Earth's most patient achievement, the slow, inexorable transformation of our planet's atmosphere from a reducing environment where oxygen was poison to one where it became the foundation of complex life. This is the story of the Great Breathing, a process so gradual that it unfolded over 500 million years, yet so profound that it reshaped the chemistry of an entire world. To truly understand this transformation, I must adjust my perception to encompass not just years or centuries, but geological epochs. Come with me as we witness the slowest chemical revolution in Earth's history, a change measured not in dramatic events, but in the accumulation of individual oxygen molecules, one by one, breath by breath, across hundreds of millions of years. We begin our journey 1.6 billion years ago, when atmospheric oxygen hovers around 1%, barely detectable, immediately consumed by the vast chemical hunger of a reduced world. To the dominant life forms of this era, oxygen is a lethal waste product, a toxic byproduct of photosynthesis that must be carefully managed and quickly neutralized. I position myself within a cyanobacterial cell, one of the countless microscopic factories that produce this dangerous gas. The cell's interior is a marvel of protective engineering. Specialized enzymes stand ready to neutralize any oxygen that threatens to damage essential proteins. Catalase breaks down hydrogen peroxide. Superoxide dismutase neutralizes oxygen radicals. The cell treats its own photosynthetic product as a hazardous waste requiring constant vigilance. Yet even as individual cells protect themselves, they collectively release millions of tons of oxygen into the environment each year. Most of this oxygen is immediately consumed, reacting with iron dissolved in the oceans, combining with sulfur compounds rising from volcanic vents, oxidizing organic matter in sediments. The planet itself serves as a vast oxygen sink, hungrily consuming this reactive gas faster than life can produce it. But not all oxygen is consumed. I track individual O2 molecules as they escape these immediate chemical reactions. One molecule in 10,000 avoids reaction long enough to reach the atmosphere. One molecule in a million persists for months. One molecule in a billion survives for years, contributing to the slow, almost theoretical accumulation of free oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. This accumulation is so gradual as to be nearly imperceptible. Over the course of a million years, atmospheric oxygen levels might rise by 0.01%. Over 10 million years, by 0.1%. Its chemical change at the pace of continental drift, transformation measured in geological epochs rather than lifetimes. To understand the Great Breathing, I must observe the epic chemical battle between oxygen and iron that dominates the middle phase of the Boring Billion. The oceans of this era contain vast quantities of dissolved iron that has been accumulating since Earth's formation, held in solution by the oxygen-free environment. I descend to the sea floor, where this battle is most visible. The formation of banded iron formations, those distinctive rock layers that alternate between iron-rich and iron-poor bands. Each band tells the story of a chemical pulse, a surge in oxygen production that precipitates dissolved iron from the water column. The process unfolds like a very slow storm. During periods of high biological productivity, cyanobacteria bloom in the surface waters, pumping oxygen into the sea. This oxygen immediately reacts with dissolved iron, forming insoluble iron oxides that rain down like red snow. The water clears as iron is stripped from solution, leaving behind bands of iron-rich sediment. But the clearing is temporary. As the bloom subsides and oxygen production decreases, iron begins to accumulate again. Rivers continue to deliver dissolved iron from weathered rocks. Volcanic vents release iron from Earth's interior. Gradually, iron concentrations build back up, ready for the next pulse of oxygenation. This cycle repeats with clockwork regularity. Not the daily or seasonal cycles of weather, but cycles measured in thousands or tens of thousands of years. Each cycle removes a fraction of the ocean's iron reservoir, slowly but inexorably clearing the seas of this oxygen sink. It's a war of attrition, fought with chemistry instead of weapons. Victory measured in parts per million over millions of years. I witnessed the formation of one particular banded iron formation over the course of 50 million years. Layer by layer, the seafloor accumulates the chemical record of this ancient battle. Dark bands rich in iron oxide alternate with lighter bands of silica and other minerals. The rhythm is hypnotic. Oxidation, precipitation, burial, repeat. Each band no thicker than a sheet of paper, yet together they build formations hundreds of feet thick. The formation I observe will eventually become part of the great iron ore deposits that future civilizations will mine. These rocks represent the largest transfer of iron in Earth's history. Billions of tons of metal stripped from the oceans and locked away in stone. It's industrial chemistry on a planetary scale, but accomplished by microscopic bacteria over unimaginable spans of time. As I continue my observation through the middle centuries of the Boring Billion, I witness a gradual but crucial shift. The rate of oxygen production slowly begins to exceed the rate of consumption. It's not dramatic. The excess might be only one molecule in 100 million. But over millions of years, this tiny imbalance compounds like interest in nature's bank account. The first sign of approaching change is the behavior of iron formations. The bands become less regular, less pronounced. Periods between iron precipitation events grow longer as the ocean's iron reservoir is gradually exhausted. By 1.4 billion years ago, Most of the easily accessible iron has been stripped from the seas, removing Earth's primary oxygen sink. Without iron to consume it immediately, oxygen begins to accumulate in ways not seen for hundreds of millions of years. Atmospheric concentrations creep upward, from 1% to 1.5%, then to 2%. These seem like tiny increases, but they represent a fundamental shift in planetary chemistry. The effects cascade through Earth's systems like a very slow avalanche. Rocks that have been stable for billions of years begin to rust more deeply as oxygen penetrates further into the crust. Red beds, sedimentary rocks stained with iron oxides, become more common and more intensely colored. The continents themselves begin to blush red as oxygen rewrites the mineral recipes of near-surface rocks. In the atmosphere, I observed the first tentative formation of an ozone layer. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun splits oxygen molecules, creating highly reactive ozone that can absorb UV radiation. The process is slow and inefficient at these low oxygen concentrations, but it begins to provide some protection from the lethal radiation that has sterilized Earth's surface for billions of years. As oxygen levels cross the 2% threshold around 1.3 billion years ago, I witnessed the beginning of a metabolic revolution that will reshape the entire biosphere. For the first time since the evolution of photosynthesis, new metabolic pathways become thermodynamically favorable. I observed the first tentative experiments with aerobic respiration. Bacteria learning to use oxygen as an electron acceptor, extracting far more energy from organic compounds than anaerobic fermentation could provide. It's like the difference between burning wood and letting it rot. Both processes release energy, but combustion releases it much faster and more completely. The advantages of oxygen respiration are enormous. Bacteria that master this new metabolism can extract nearly 20 times more energy from the same amount of food. They can grow faster, reproduce more frequently, and support more complex cellular machinery. But they pay a price. They must evolve sophisticated systems to protect themselves from oxygen's toxic effects. I follow the evolution of one such organism through millions of years of adaptation. Initially, it can tolerate only tiny amounts of oxygen, concentrations that would be imperceptible to modern organisms. But gradually, generation by generation, it develops better antioxidant systems, more robust DNA repair mechanisms, more efficient detoxification pathways. The process is painstakingly slow. Each improvement in oxygen tolerance takes thousands of years to evolve and spread through the population. Each increase in oxygen levels forces another round of adaptation. It's an evolutionary arms race between organisms and their own waste product, played out over geological time. But the rewards justify the effort. Organisms that successfully adapt to oxygen gain access to energy resources unavailable to their anaerobic cousins. They can colonize environments previously uninhabitable, exploit food sources previously unusable, and engage in activities previously impossible. As atmospheric oxygen levels continue their slow rise toward 3%, I observe the beginning of what can only be called the Great Rusting, the oxidation of Earth's continental surfaces on a scale never seen before or since. The process begins subtly. Rocks exposed to the atmosphere start to develop thin rinds of iron oxide, rust-colored coatings just micrometers thick. But these coatings are the beginning of a transformation that will eventually penetrate miles into the crust. Oxygen-rich water seeps into fractures, carrying the chemical signature of the surface into Earth's depths. I follow one such fracture system as it slowly fills with oxidized groundwater over the course of millions of years. the water reacts with iron-bearing minerals, converting black magnetite to red hematite, transforming sulfide minerals to sulfates, changing the fundamental chemistry of the rock. The effects are visible from space. Continental surfaces that have been grey and brown for billions of years begin to show patches of red, iron-stained badlands that will become the signature landscape of the later Proterozoic. Australia, North America, Africa, all the ancient continental cores developed their characteristic red coloration during this period. But the Great Rusting is more than a cosmetic change. It represents a fundamental shift in the way Earth's surface and atmosphere interact. For the first time in planetary history, the atmosphere becomes an active chemical agent, capable of altering rocks and minerals through oxidation, rather than simple physical weathering. The implications for life are profound. As rocks oxidize, they release nutrients like phosphorus and trace metals that have been locked away in reduced minerals for billions of years. These nutrients fertilize the oceans, supporting larger populations of photosynthetic organisms, which produce more oxygen, which drives more oxidation. It's a positive feedback loop that accelerates the pace of atmospheric change. As I continue my observation through the later phases of the Great Breathing, I witness the evolution of an elegant chemical solution to the oxygen problem, the sulfur cycle. Bacteria learn to use oxidized sulfur compounds as alternatives to oxygen, creating a new set of metabolic pathways that can function in the changing atmosphere. The sulfur cycle begins with the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg gas produced by anaerobic bacteria. As oxygen levels rise, this hydrogen sulfide reacts with oxygen to form sulfate, which dissolves in seawater and accumulates in the oceans. But what seems like a simple oxidation reaction actually creates opportunities for entirely new forms of metabolism. I observe bacteria that learn to use sulfate as an electron acceptor, essentially breathing sulfate instead of oxygen. This sulfate reduction produces hydrogen sulfide, completing a cycle that allows life to extract energy from sulfur compounds without requiring high oxygen concentrations. It's a metabolic compromise, less efficient than oxygen respiration, but more efficient than fermentation. The sulfur cycle becomes increasingly complex as more organisms learn to exploit its various stages. Some bacteria specialize in oxidizing different sulfur compounds. Others learn to store sulfur in granules within their cells. Still others develop symbiotic relationships with sulfur-cycling bacteria, creating miniature ecosystems based on sulfur chemistry. This sulfur-based metabolism provides a bridge between the anaerobic world of the early boring billion and the oxygen-rich world that will eventually emerge. Organisms that master sulfur cycling can survive and thrive in environments with intermediate oxygen levels, neither fully anaerobic nor fully aerobic. By 1.0 billion years ago, as the boring billion approaches its end, atmospheric oxygen levels have reached nearly 5%, high enough to support the first experiments with complex multicellular organization, but still far below the levels needed for large active organisms. I observe the atmosphere itself becoming more dynamic. With higher oxygen concentrations, weather patterns begin to change. Oxidation reactions in the atmosphere create new types of aerosols and cloud condensation nuclei. The greenhouse effect weakens as oxidizing conditions favor the breakdown of methane and other reduced greenhouse gases. The result is the beginning of a long-term cooling trend that will eventually lead to the first global ice ages since the early Proterozoic. But this cooling is gradual, measured in millions of years, giving lifetime to adapt to changing conditions. In the oceans, The rising oxygen levels create new ecological zones. The boundary between oxygenated surface waters and anoxic depths, the chemocline, becomes a dynamic frontier where different types of organisms compete for resources. Some bacteria specialize in living right at this boundary, using both oxygen and reduced compounds depending on local conditions. The deep ocean basins, still largely anoxic, serve as refuges for ancient anaerobic life forms, but they also become laboratories for new kinds of metabolism that can function in the changing chemical environment. It's in these deep, oxygen-free waters that some of the most sophisticated bacterial ecosystems evolve, complex communities that can survive and thrive without any oxygen at all. As the Great Breathing approaches its culmination, I witness the emergence of conditions that will make complex life possible. The slow accumulation of oxygen over 500 million years has transformed Earth from a reduced planet hostile to complex chemistry into an oxidizing world where sophisticated biochemistry can flourish. The first eukaryotic cells begin to appear, their evolution made possible by the availability of oxygen for aerobic respiration and by the protective ozone layer that screens out lethal ultraviolet radiation. These early complex cells are still rare and fragile, but they represent a new chapter in the story of life. I observe one of these early eukaryotes as it encounters an oxygen-rich environment for the first time. Its mitochondria, former bacteria that have learned to live symbiotically within the larger cell, rev up their metabolism, extracting energy from oxygen with unprecedented efficiency. The cell can now support internal structures and processes impossible in the low-energy world of bacterial fermentation. The Great Breathing has not just changed the atmosphere, it has changed the very possibilities of life. Complex cellular structures, active locomotion, predation, and eventually multicellularity all become feasible in ways they never were in the oxygen-poor world of the early boring billion. Yet even as I witness these first stirrings of complexity, I'm struck by the patience required for this transformation. 500 million years of gradual change, molecule by molecule, breath by breath, to transform a planet. No dramatic events, no sudden shifts, just the slow, inexorable accumulation of oxygen until a threshold was crossed and new possibilities opened. The Great Breathing teaches us that the most profound changes often occur too slowly to perceive. Earth's atmosphere didn't transform overnight, but through the patient work of countless organisms over unimaginable spans of time. Each cyanobacterium that split a water molecule, each iron atom that rusted, each sulfur compound that oxidized, all contributed to a planetary transformation that made our own existence possible. As I prepare to leave this 500 million year journey through atmospheric evolution, I reflect on what the Great Breathing reveals about the nature of change itself. True transformation, the kind that reshapes worlds, doesn't come from sudden inspiration or dramatic events. It comes from patience, persistence, and the accumulation of countless small contributions over vast expanses of time. The oxygen we breathe, the ozone that protects us, the iron in our blood, all are products of the Great Breathing, gifts from the patient work of ancient bacteria across 500 million years. We are not just children of the stars, but heirs to the longest construction project in Earth's history. The slow, careful preparation of an atmosphere that could support complex life. The Great Breathing reminds us that some achievements cannot be rushed, that some changes require not just years or decades, but eons of patient work. It shows us that the impossible can become inevitable If we're willing to think in terms of deep time and accept that the most important changes happen so slowly that they're invisible to any single lifetime. Rest now in the knowledge that every breath you take connects you to this ancient story, to the bacterial ancestors who spent 500 million years preparing the air you breathe, to the slow accumulation of oxygen that made your consciousness possible, to the great breathing that transformed the world and made complex life not just possible, but inevitable. 700 million years into the boring billion, I position myself to observe the minute changes that accumulate over geological time. To human perception, this world would seem utterly static, unchanging from 1 million years to the next. But with my expanded awareness, I can perceive the subtle variations, the tiny experiments, the gradual shifts that prepare the way for dramatic changes to come. I begin at the cellular level, observing the bacteria that dominate this world. Though they appear similar to their ancestors from hundreds of millions of years earlier, careful observation reveals countless small innovations. Some cyanobacteria have developed slightly more efficient photosynthetic machinery, capturing a fraction more energy from each photon. Others have improved their nitrogen-fixing capabilities, able to convert atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia with less energy expenditure. These improvements are tiny, perhaps a 1% increase in efficiency here, a 2% improvement there. But compounded over millions of years, they add up. The bacteria of this era are significantly more sophisticated than their ancestors, even if they look identical. It's evolution in its most patient mode, refining and optimizing rather than innovating. I observe a particularly interesting development in some coastal bacteria. They've evolved the ability to produce compounds that protect them from ultraviolet radiation. The ozone layer is still thin in this era, allowing damaging UV to reach the surface. These bacteria synthesize their own sunscreen, molecules that absorb UV and dissipate it as harmless heat. This innovation spread slowly through the bacterial community. Gene transfer in bacteria doesn't require reproduction. They can pass useful genes directly to their neighbors through a process called horizontal gene transfer. I watch as the UV protection genes spread like a very slow wildfire through bacterial populations, taking thousands of years to move from one coastline to another. The stromatolites, too, show subtle changes over time. Early in the boring billion, most grew as simple domes or columns. But as I observe populations from later periods, I see increasing complexity in their growth patterns. Some develop intricate branching structures that maximize surface area for photosynthesis. Others evolve ways to channel water flow, creating more efficient nutrient delivery systems. I spent decades observing one stromatolite community as it responds to a gradual change in water depth. Sea level is rising slowly due to changes in ocean basin configuration. Only inches per century, but to the stromatolites, this is a significant environmental shift. The bacterial community must constantly adjust, with deeper water species gradually replacing shallow water ones. The transition is remarkably smooth. There's no sudden die-off or dramatic replacement. Instead, the community composition shifts gradually, with some species becoming rarer while others increase. It's like watching a very slow dissolve between two photographs, taking thousands of years to complete. Chemical changes in the ocean also accumulate subtly. I monitor the concentration of various dissolved minerals over millions of years. Iron, once abundant in the oceans, becomes progressively scarcer as it's oxidized and precipitated out. Sulfate concentrations rise slowly as sulfur is weathered from rocks and oxidized by the limited atmospheric oxygen. These chemical shifts drive evolutionary adaptations. Bacteria that once relied on abundant dissolved iron must develop more efficient iron uptake systems or switch to alternative metabolisms. I observe populations of purple bacteria gradually shifting their preferences, some learning to use sulfate instead of elemental sulfur in their photosynthesis. The climate, too, shows subtle variations within its overall stability. I track temperature changes over millions of years, finding slow cycles driven by variations in Earth's orbit and the gradual brightening of the sun. The temperature might vary by only 5 degrees Fahrenheit over a 10 million year cycle, but this is enough to shift the boundaries between different bacterial communities. During warmer periods, tropical bacterial communities expand toward the poles. Stromatolite reefs grow faster and larger. Purple bacteria bloom in higher latitudes. During cooler periods, these communities contract, and cold-adapted bacteria expand their range. It's like breathing, but with each breath taking millions of years. I observe particularly interesting changes in the deep ocean, as oxygen levels creep imperceptibly higher, still far below modern levels, but increasing from 1% to perhaps 2% of the atmosphere. The depth at which oxygen penetrates the ocean increases. This pushes anaerobic bacteria deeper, creating new ecological zones. The boundary between oxygenated surface waters and anoxic deep waters becomes a hotspot of chemical activity. Bacteria specialize in exploiting this gradient, using the chemical energy available when oxygen meets reduced compounds from below. New metabolic pathways evolve to take advantage of these conditions, adding complexity to the global chemical cycles. On land, subtle changes are also accumulating. The bacterial mats that coat damp surfaces are slowly modifying the rocks they grow on. Their acids etch microscopic channels and pores, increasing the surface area available for colonization. Over millions of years, they're literally creating new habitats for themselves, turning smooth rock into complex three-dimensional surfaces. I observe one rock face over 100 million year period. What begins as a smooth granite surface gradually becomes pitted and channeled. Bacteria colonize each new microhabitat, secreting acids that deepen the channels further. By the end of my observation, the rock looks like a miniature canyon system, all carved by microscopic life. The accumulation of organic matter is another subtle but significant change. Every bacterial mat, every stromatolite, every purple bloom that dies and is buried removes carbon from the active cycle. Layer by layer, this organic matter accumulates in sediments. The total amount buried each year is tiny, but over hundreds of millions of years, it adds up to enormous quantities. This buried carbon has multiple effects. It gradually reduces atmospheric carbon dioxide, contributing to the stable but slowly cooling climate. It also creates reducing conditions in sediments, allowing minerals to form that couldn't exist in oxygen-rich environments. And it stores energy that will eventually become fossil fuels, though that release is still far in the future. I noticed changes in the diversity of bacterial communities over time. Early in the boring billion, most communities are dominated by a few successful species. But as time passes, niche specialization increases. I count more species in a single stromatolite from late in the era than in entire reefs from earlier periods. It's a quiet diversification, lacking the drama of later evolutionary explosions, but significant nonetheless. The interactions between different bacterial species also become more complex over time. Simple competition gives way to elaborate partnerships. I observe consortia of bacteria that can only survive together. each providing essential nutrients or services to the others. These partnerships are so integrated that they function almost as single organisms, presaging the endosymbiosis that will create complex cells. Perhaps most significantly, I observed the gradual appearance of new cellular structures in some bacteria. Small internal membranes begin to compartmentalize certain chemical reactions. Protein complexes become more elaborate, able to perform more sophisticated chemistry. The bacteria are pushing the limits of what's possible without a true nucleus, setting the stage for the evolution of eukaryotic cells. All these changes happen so slowly that they're invisible on human timescales. A scientist studying these bacteria might observe them for an entire career without seeing any evolution. But stretched over the hundreds of millions of years of the boring billion, the changes are profound. The world at the end of this era, while superficially similar to the beginning, is actually quite different in countless subtle ways. It's like watching a mountain erode. Day to day, year to year, even century to century, the mountain seems permanent, unchanging. But over millions of years, it's worn down grain by grain, its material redistributed across continents. The boring billion is Earth's biological mountain, being reshaped particle by particle into something new. These subtle changes are the secret power of the boring billion. While nothing dramatic happens, everything is being prepared. Chemical cycles are being refined. Metabolic pathways are being optimized. Genetic tools are being developed. The stage is being set, props positioned, actors rehearsed, for the dramatic changes that will end this long stability. The boring billion teaches patience. It shows that change doesn't always come in revolutions. Sometimes it comes in the accumulation of tiny improvements, the gradual exploration of possibilities, the slow perfection of existing systems. It's evolution as craftsmanship rather than inspiration, and the results are no less profound for being achieved slowly. As I watch these subtle changes accumulate like interest in nature's bank, I'm reminded that all of Earth's history is like this. Even the most dramatic events are preceded by long preparation, subtle changes that make the dramatic possible. The boring billion is not a pause in Earth's story, but a long, careful preparation for the next chapter. 900 million years into the boring billion, I turn my attention to the chemical changes occurring throughout Earth's system. While life appears static, the planet's chemistry is slowly but inexorably shifting, preparing the conditions that will eventually end this long stability and usher in a new world. I begin in the atmosphere, that thin envelope of gas that separates Earth from the vacuum of space. The composition has been stable for hundreds of millions of years. Nitrogen dominates at about 78%, similar to your time. But the remaining gases tell a different story. Oxygen hovers between 1 and 2%, occasionally reaching 3% in local areas of high photosynthetic activity. Carbon dioxide is more abundant than in your era, helping maintain the warm, stable climate. But subtle changes are occurring. I track individual oxygen molecules as they're produced by cyanobacteria, following their fate. Most are immediately consumed, reacting with iron in rocks, combining with organic matter, being breathed by anaerobic bacteria that use it for metabolism. But not all. A tiny fraction, perhaps one molecule in a million, escapes these fates and remains free in the atmosphere. This accumulation is so slow as to be almost theoretical. The oxygen concentration might rise by 0.1% over 100 million years, but it's rising nonetheless, like a bathtub filling one drop at a time. And certain thresholds once crossed will trigger cascading changes. I observe the effects of this creeping oxygenation on the planet's surface. Iron-bearing rocks that have been stable for eons begin to rust more deeply. The red color that stains the continents grows more intense. New minerals form that can only exist in the presence of oxygen: hematite, goethite, and others. The planet is literally rusting, though so slowly that the change is invisible except over geological time. In the oceans, the chemical changes are even more complex. I position myself at the boundary between oxygenated surface waters and the anoxic depths. This chemocline, as scientists call it, is a zone of intense chemical activity. Elements change their oxidation states as they cross this boundary, precipitating out or dissolving back into solution. The depth of this boundary varies with location and time, but I notice a gradual trend. Early in the boring billion, oxygen penetrates only the top few feet of the ocean. By this point, it reaches down 30 or 40 feet in some areas. The volume of oxygenated water has increased dramatically, even though the percentage of oxygen hasn't changed much. This expanding oxygenated zone has profound effects on ocean chemistry. Elements that are soluble in anoxic water become insoluble when oxidized. I watch as dissolved manganese encounters oxygen and precipitates as manganese oxide, forming dark crusts on the sea floor. These manganese deposits will eventually become ore bodies that future civilizations will mine. Sulfur chemistry is particularly affected. In the anoxic depths, sulfur exists mostly as hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg-smelling gas that many bacteria use for photosynthesis. But when it encounters oxygen, it's oxidized to sulfate. I track this transformation, watching as sulfide from deep waters rises, meets oxygen, and is converted. The sulfate then spreads throughout the ocean, changing the chemical environment for all life. The increasing sulfate levels enable new metabolic pathways. Some bacteria evolve the ability to use sulfate as an electron acceptor, essentially breathing it instead of oxygen. This sulfate reduction produces hydrogen sulfide, completing a new sulfur cycle. It's less efficient than oxygen respiration, but much better than fermentation, allowing bacteria to extract more energy from their food. I observe colonies of these sulfate-reducing bacteria in seafloor sediments. They form partnerships with other organisms, creating miniature ecosystems in the mud. Methane-producing bacteria provide organic compounds. Sulfate reducers consume these compounds, producing hydrogen sulfide. Other bacteria oxidize the hydrogen sulfide, completing the cycle. It's a complex metabolic web that couldn't exist without the slow accumulation of sulfate in the oceans. Carbon chemistry is also slowly shifting. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are gradually declining as carbon is buried in sediments and locked away in carbonate rocks. I follow carbon atoms from their absorption by photosynthetic bacteria through their incorporation into organic molecules, their burial in sediments, and their eventual lithification into rock. This carbon burial is removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, contributing to a very gradual cooling trend. The effect is tiny, perhaps 1 degree Fahrenheit over 100 million years, but it's consistent. The warm, stable climate of the early boring billion is slowly giving way to something slightly cooler, setting the stage for the ice ages that will eventually follow. Nitrogen cycling is becoming more sophisticated as well. Early in Earth's history, nitrogen fixation, converting atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia, was performed by only a few types of bacteria. But I now observe dozens of different nitrogen-fixing systems, each optimized for different conditions. Some work in oxygen-free environments, others can tolerate low oxygen levels. the global nitrogen cycle has become more robust, able to maintain itself despite changing conditions. Phosphorus, that essential element for life, follows its own slow cycle. I track phosphorus atoms as they're weathered from rocks, carried to the sea by rivers, incorporated into living organisms, and eventually deposited in sediments. Some phosphorus-rich deposits form in areas of high biological productivity, creating phosphorite rocks that will be important resources in the future. But perhaps the most significant chemical preparation is happening at the cellular level. Some bacteria are accumulating higher concentrations of certain elements than ever before. I observe cyanobacteria that concentrate iron in special proteins, protecting their photosynthetic machinery from oxygen damage. Others accumulate copper, zinc, and other trace elements, using them as cofactors in increasingly complex enzymes. These trace elements enable new chemistry. Copper-containing enzymes can catalyze reactions impossible for proteins alone. Zinc fingers allow more precise control of gene expression. Molybdenum enables efficient nitrogen fixation. Life is building a more sophisticated chemical toolkit, one enzyme at a time. I'm particularly intrigued by changes in cellular membranes. Early bacteria had simple membranes made of basic lipids, but I now observe membranes with more complex lipids, including some with branched chains and multiple rings. These new lipids make membranes more stable, more selective in what they allow to pass. They're approaching the sophistication needed for eukaryotic cells. The slow accumulation of oxygen is also driving the evolution of antioxidant systems. Oxygen is useful but dangerous. It readily forms reactive compounds that can damage proteins, lipids, and DNA. I observe bacteria evolving increasingly sophisticated defenses. Catalase enzymes break down hydrogen peroxide. Superoxide dismutases neutralize superoxide radicals. Glutathione systems mop up various reactive oxygen species. These antioxidant systems are metabolically expensive, requiring energy and resources to maintain, but they allow bacteria to survive in increasingly oxidizing environments. They're chemical preparations for a future oxygen-rich world, evolved millions of years before that world will exist. The chemical changes extend to the sediments accumulating on the seafloor. Layer by layer, different chemical signatures are preserved. Periods of higher oxygen leave oxidized minerals. Anoxic events deposit reduced compounds. Variations in biological productivity change the amount of organic matter. These sediments are chemical libraries, recording the slow changes of the boring billion. I observe the formation of banded iron formations, those distinctive rocks with alternating layers of iron-rich and iron-poor minerals. Each band represents a chemical event, perhaps a bloom of oxygen-producing cyanobacteria that precipitated dissolved iron, followed by a return to anoxic conditions. The bands are like tree rings, recording years, centuries, millennia of chemical change. Even the trace gases in the atmosphere are slowly changing. Methane levels fluctuate as methanogenic bacteria wax and wane. Hydrogen sulfide occasionally spikes during volcanic events. Nitrous oxide appears in tiny quantities as the nitrogen cycle becomes more complex. Each gas influences climate and chemistry in subtle ways. All these chemical changes are interconnected, forming feedback loops that stabilize some processes, while slowly pushing others toward change. Increasing oxygen enables more efficient metabolism, which produces more oxygen. Sulfate accumulation enables sulfate reduction, which consumes organic matter that would otherwise use up oxygen. Carbon burial reduces greenhouse gases, but also removes nutrients from the system. The chemical preparation of the boring billion is like a very slow fuse burning toward an explosion. Each small change makes the next change possible. Oxygen accumulates molecule by molecule. New metabolic pathways evolve reaction by reaction. Minerals form crystal by crystal. None of these changes alone would transform the world, but together they're preparing a chemical revolution. As I observe these patient chemical transformations, I'm struck by the deep time required for planetary change. Earth doesn't transform overnight. It takes hundreds of millions of years of chemical preparation before sudden changes become possible. The boring billion is Earth's chemical laboratory, slowly developing the reagents that will react dramatically when conditions are finally right. The chemistry of Earth is never truly boring. Even in this most stable period of our planet's history, reactions are occurring, elements are cycling, new possibilities are being explored. The boring billion is a testament to the power of gradual chemical change to reshape a world. Lessons from 1 billion years of patience. As we approach the end of our journey through the boring billion, let us pause to contemplate what this vast span of time teaches us about patience, persistence, and the hidden power of apparent stillness. For in this longest chapter of Earth's middle age, we find profound lessons about the nature of meaningful change and the quiet heroism of preparation. In your world of hurried days and instant communication, the concept of 1 billion years stretches beyond comprehension. Yet here, in this ancient time, patience was not merely a virtue, but a fundamental organizing principle of existence. Every innovation took millions of years to perfect. Every adaptation required countless generations of refinement. Every achievement built upon eons of careful preparation. Consider the stromatolites we have observed. Those bacterial cities growing layer by microscopic layer, century after century, millennium after millennium. To human perception, their growth would be imperceptible. You could observe a stromatolite for your entire lifetime and never see it change. Yet over the deep time of the boring billion, these structures grew to be hundreds of feet tall, created entire reef systems, and fundamentally altered the chemistry of the oceans. This teaches us something profound about the nature of meaningful change. The transformations that matter most, the ones that reshape worlds, create new possibilities, and prepare the foundation for future complexity. These do not announce themselves with drama or spectacle. They occur in the quiet spaces between moments, in the accumulation of countless small actions, in the patient repetition of simple processes that compound over unimaginable scales of time. In your own life, you have experienced echoes of this principle. The most important changes, the development of wisdom, the deepening of love, the mastery of skill, the growth of understanding. These too happen slowly, imperceptibly, through patient practice and persistent effort. Like the bacteria of the boring billion, you are always changing, always growing, always preparing, even when you cannot perceive the transformation occurring within you. The boring billion teaches us that there is no shame in slowness, no failure in quiet progress. The bacteria that dominated this era never rushed, never compromised quality for speed, never abandoned their essential nature in pursuit of dramatic change. They perfected the art of being themselves with such thoroughness that their innovations became the foundation for all complex life to come. To modern sensibilities, the repetitive nature of the boring billion might seem monotonous, even pointless. The same chemical cycles turning endlessly, the same bacterial communities repeating their daily rhythms for millions of years, the same environmental patterns playing out with clockwork regularity across geological time. But this repetition was not mindless or empty. Each cycle was an opportunity for refinement, each repetition a chance for improvement, each apparent return to the beginning, actually a spiral ascent to greater sophistication. The bacteria of this era understood something that your hurried world often forgets: that mastery comes not from constant novelty, but from the patient perfection of fundamental processes. Think of the cyanobacteria that spent hundreds of millions of years perfecting photosynthesis. Each day, they captured sunlight, converted carbon dioxide to sugar, and released oxygen as a waste product. The process seemed identical across vast spans of time, yet subtle improvements accumulated. Efficiency increased by fractions of a percent. New metabolic pathways opened. The very chemistry of life was gradually optimized through countless repetitions of the same basic process. This wisdom of repetition echoes through your own experience, the practices that transform you most profoundly. Meditation, exercise, creative work, loving relationships. These are not activities you do once and master forever. They are ongoing processes that deepen through patient repetition, spiral paths that return you again and again to familiar territory, but at higher levels of understanding. The boring billion shows us that repetition is not the enemy of progress, but its most reliable vehicle. In a world obsessed with innovation and disruption, the bacteria of this era achieved something more valuable. They created stability so profound, preparation so thorough, that it could support innovations beyond imagination. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the boring billion is the recognition that preparation is itself a form of heroism. The bacteria and other microorganisms of this era were not passive waiters for some future transformation. They were active participants in the greatest preparation project in Earth's history. The slow, patient creation of conditions that would make complex life possible. Every oxygen molecule produced by photosynthesis, every iron atom oxidized and precipitated, every organic compound buried in sediments. These were acts of preparation for a future none of these organisms could imagine. They were building the ozone layer that would protect future life from radiation. They were creating the chemical gradients that would power complex metabolism. They were establishing the recycling systems that would support intricate food webs. This hidden heroism of preparation is perhaps the most difficult virtue to recognize because its benefits are not immediate or obvious. The cyanobacteria that spent their lives producing toxic oxygen received no reward for their efforts. The bacteria that slowly built stromatolite reefs could not know they were creating habitats for future organisms. The patient work of chemical preparation happened without fanfare, without recognition, without any guarantee of future payoff. Yet without this preparation, none of the complexity we see in your world would be possible. The oxygen you breathe, the complex cells that compose your body, the intricate ecosystems that support your life, all are built upon the foundation laid during the boring billion. The bacteria of this era were the unsung heroes of evolution, the patient gardeners who prepared Earth's soil for the complex life to come. In your own life, you engage in similar acts of hidden heroism. Every moment of preparation that receives no immediate reward. Studying for knowledge you may not use for years. Building relationships that may not bear fruit immediately. Developing skills that await their proper moment. These are echoes of the boring billion's patient work. You are always preparing, always laying groundwork, always participating in the slow construction of future possibilities, even when you cannot see the ultimate purpose of your efforts. The boring billion teaches us to honor this preparation, to recognize it as meaningful work, to find purpose in the patient cultivation of conditions for future growth. One of the most remarkable aspects of the boring billion is how democratic it was in its distribution of time. No single organism, no matter how successful, could monopolize the vast spans of time available. Every bacterium, every chemical reaction, every geological process had access to the same abundant resource, time itself. This democratization of time allowed for a kind of thoroughness impossible in more dynamic eras. Every possibility could be explored, every adaptation could be tested, every innovation could be refined to perfection. There was no pressure to rush, no competition for scarce temporal resources, no need to accept partial solutions when complete ones were possible given enough time. The bacteria of this era were wealthy in the only currency that truly matters for deep transformation: time. They spent this wealth lavishly, taking millions of years to accomplish what later organisms would attempt in thousands, but achieving a level of optimization and stability that would prove invaluable when rapid change eventually came. In your compressed human experience, time often feels scarce, pressured, insufficient for the deep changes you wish to make. The boring billion reminds us that the most profound transformations require not just effort, but time. Deep time, patient time, abundant time, freely given to the slow work of becoming. While you cannot extend your individual lifetime to geological scales, you can participate in the democratic time of human culture, contributing to projects that will outlast you, building knowledge that will benefit future generations, participating in the slow construction of wisdom that accumulates across many lifetimes. The boring billion teaches us that stability is not a passive state, but an active achievement requiring constant maintenance and adjustment. The apparent stillness of this era was actually the product of countless dynamic processes working in harmony. Chemical cycles that maintained atmospheric composition, biological communities that recycled nutrients with extraordinary efficiency, physical processes that regulated climate within narrow bounds. This stability was not rigid, but resilient, not unchanging, but self-correcting. When perturbations occurred, storms that buried bacterial mats, volcanic eruptions that changed ocean chemistry, climate shifts that altered temperature patterns, the system responded with subtle adjustments that maintained overall equilibrium while allowing for gradual improvement. The bacteria that created this stability understood something profound about the nature of sustainable systems. They prioritized cooperation over competition, efficiency over growth, long-term stability over short-term advantage. They created what we might recognize as the first truly sustainable civilization, one that persisted for 1 billion years without exhausting its resources or destroying its environment. In your world of rapid change and environmental crisis, the wisdom of the boring billion offers a different model, not of stagnation, but of dynamic stability, not of growth at any cost, but of sustainable prosperity, not of individual success, but of collective flourishing across vast scales of time. The bacterial communities of this era show us that the most successful civilizations are those that learn to live within their means, that prioritize the health of the whole over the growth of parts, that think in terms of deep time rather than immediate gratification. Perhaps the most paradoxical lesson of the boring billion is that the most profound revolutions can occur in perfect stillness. While the surface of this era appeared unchanging, beneath that stable exterior, the most fundamental transformations in the history of life were taking place. The evolution of complex cells through endo-symbiosis, the gradual oxygenation of the atmosphere, the development of sophisticated biochemical pathways, the establishment of global nutrient cycles. All of these world-changing developments occurred without fanfare, without drama, without any external sign that revolution was in progress. This teaches us to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating the significance of any period or process. What seems boring or static from the outside may be undergoing profound internal transformation. What appears unchanging may be the site of the most important preparation for future change. In your own life, your most transformative periods may be the quiet ones, times when nothing seems to be happening externally, but everything is changing internally. The Boring Billion reminds us to honor these periods of apparent stillness, to trust the invisible work of transformation, to have faith in the slow processes that reshape us from within. As we conclude this meditation on the wisdom of the Boring Billion, reflect on the profound gift it offers to your understanding, the gift of deep time perspective. In a world obsessed with immediate results and instant gratification, the patient billion-year breath of this era offers a different way of thinking about change, progress, and the meaning of a life well lived. The bacteria of the Boring Billion lived brief individual lives, a few hours or days at most, but they participated in projects that spanned eons. They understood, perhaps better than any organisms before or since, that significance is not measured in the length of individual existence, but in the contribution to ongoing processes larger than any single life. Every cyanobacterium that ever lived during the Boring Billion has been dead for hundreds of millions of years. Yet their collective work, the oxygen they produced, the organic matter they created, the chemical cycles they established, continues to this day. They achieved a kind of immortality, not through individual persistence, but through participation in the eternal processes of planetary life. This perspective invites you to see your own brief existence in the context of deep time, to recognize that while your individual life is short, your participation in the ongoing project of human consciousness, culture, and creativity connects you to processes that extend far beyond your personal timeline. Like the bacteria of the Boring Billion, you are both temporary and eternal. Temporary in your individual form, but eternal in your contribution to the continuing story of complexity, consciousness, and connection that defines the deepest meaning of life. The Boring Billion teaches us that true significance comes not from dramatic gesture, but from patient participation, not from individual achievement, but from collective contribution, not from the length of our personal existence, but from the depth of our connection to the ongoing processes of growth, transformation, and preparation that define life's deepest purpose. Rest now in this deep time perspective, knowing that you are part of a story much larger than yourself, a participant in transformations that began long before your birth and will continue long after your death, a temporary manifestation of the same patient, persistent, creative force that guided Earth through its billion-year meditation and continues to guide the universe toward ever greater complexity and consciousness. 1 billion years into the Boring Billion, I position myself to observe the first signs that this long stability is beginning to falter. The changes are subtle at first, barely distinguishable from the random fluctuations that have always occurred. But to my time-expanded awareness, patterns emerge that herald the end of Earth's longest meditation. The first signs appear in the complexity of cellular organization. For 1 billion years, bacteria have dominated Earth, their simple cells lacking internal compartments or true nuclei. But now I observe cells that challenge this simplicity. They're larger than typical bacteria, with internal membranes that create distinct regions within the cell. I follow one such cell as it glides through the water. It's perhaps 10 times the size of a typical bacterium, moving with a strange rolling motion unlike anything I've seen before. Inside, I can make out what appear to be internalized bacteria, once free-living organisms now residing permanently within the larger cell. It's the beginning of endo-symbiosis, the partnership that will create complex eukaryotic cells. To understand the profound transformation occurring within this single cell, I must slow time even further and descend to the molecular level. What I witness is nothing less than the most important partnership in the history of life. The slow merger of two completely different types of organism into something entirely new. The host cell is unlike any bacterium. Its membrane is flexible, capable of folding inward to engulf objects larger than itself. This ability, called phagocytosis, is impossible for bacteria with their rigid cell walls. The host moves by extending pseudopoods, temporary projections of its membrane that flow forward like liquid fingers. It's a completely different way of being alive, one that opens up new possibilities for feeding and growth. Within this host, I observe the internalized bacteria, once free-living cyanobacteria that have become permanent residents. They retain their double membranes, their photosynthetic machinery, their ability to produce oxygen and organic compounds, but they have lost something crucial: the ability to live independently. Over millions of years of coevolution, they have transferred most of their genes to the host nucleus, becoming utterly dependent on their cellular home. This genetic transfer is a gradual process, unfolding over countless generations. I watch as individual genes are copied from the bacterium's circular chromosome and inserted into the host's nuclear DNA. It's not random. Genes encoding proteins needed for basic cellular functions are among the first to transfer, while genes for specialized functions like photosynthesis remain in the bacterium longer. Each transferred gene must be modified to work in its new environment. The host cell uses a different genetic code than bacteria, so the transferred genes must be translated into the host's molecular language. New regulatory sequences must evolve to control when and where the genes are expressed. It's like translating a complex technical manual from one language to another, while simultaneously redesigning the machines it describes. The most remarkable aspect of this genetic transfer is the coordination required. The host nucleus must learn to produce proteins that function within the internalized bacteria, while the bacteria must learn to import these proteins from outside. This requires the evolution of sophisticated transport systems, molecular machinery that can recognize specific proteins and shuttle them across multiple membranes to their proper destinations. I observed the development of one such transport system. The bacterium's outer membrane develops pores lined with specific recognition proteins. These proteins can bind to transport sequences, short amino acid signatures that mark proteins as destined for the bacterium. When a protein with the correct sequence arrives from the host nucleus, the recognition proteins grab it and thread it through the pore into the bacterium's interior. But the protein doesn't arrive naked. It's accompanied by molecular chaperones, helper proteins that keep it properly folded during transport. Once inside the bacterium, other chaperones take over, guiding the protein to its final destination and helping it assume its functional shape. It's a molecular relay race, with the protein passed from helper to helper until it reaches its target. The bacterium, meanwhile, is undergoing its own transformations. No longer needing to compete for resources or defend against threats, it can specialize entirely in photosynthesis. Its cell wall begins to simplify, losing the complex protective layers needed for free living existence. Its reproductive machinery changes, synchronizing its division cycle with that of the host. It's becoming less of an independent organism and more of a specialized organelle. This transformation is not without costs. I observe failed partnerships, hosts that die when their internalized bacteria become too specialized to survive environmental changes, bacteria that lose essential genes before the host can compensate, incompatible genetic systems that lead to cellular chaos. For every successful endo-symbiotic partnership, thousands fail. But when the partnership works, the advantages are extraordinary. The host gains the ability to harness sunlight directly, no longer dependent on consuming other organisms for energy. The bacterium gains protection from environmental threats and access to resources concentrated by the host. Together, they can exploit niches impossible for either alone. I followed this cellular partnership through hundreds of generations, watching as the relationship becomes ever more intimate. The host develops specialized membrane systems to house its bacterial partners, creating internal compartments with optimal conditions for photosynthesis. The bacteria evolve mechanisms to share their energy production more efficiently with the host, developing molecular pumps that export sugars and other energy-rich compounds. The communication between host and endosymbiont becomes increasingly sophisticated. Chemical signals flow in both directions. The host informing the bacteria about environmental conditions and nutritional needs, the bacteria reporting on their energy production and health status. They develop a cellular metabolism that integrates both partners, with the host providing raw materials and the bacteria supplying energy. But the most profound change is the evolution of the nucleus itself. The host cell's genetic material, once scattered throughout the cell like that of bacteria, becomes concentrated in a membrane-bound compartment. This nucleus serves as the cell's control center, coordinating the activities of both host and endosymbiont. It represents a completely new way of organizing cellular information, one that will prove crucial for the evolution of complex life. The nuclear membrane is not just a container, but an active participant in cellular control. It's studded with pores that regulate which molecules can enter or leave the nucleus. Proteins must present the correct molecular credentials to gain entry. RNA messages carrying genetic instructions must be processed and modified before export. It's a sophisticated security and communication system, ensuring that genetic information flows in controlled, coordinated ways. Within the nucleus, the host DNA undergoes its own organizational revolution. Instead of existing as a single circular chromosome like bacteria, the genetic material breaks up into linear chromosomes, each containing thousands of genes. These chromosomes are wrapped around protein spools called histones, creating a compact, organized storage system. It's like upgrading from a single filing cabinet to an entire library with sophisticated cataloging and retrieval systems. The implications of this nuclear organization are profound. Linear chromosomes allow for much more genetic material than circular ones. Complex regulatory systems can evolve to control gene expression with unprecedented precision. Sexual reproduction becomes possible, allowing genetic material from different individuals to be combined and recombined. The foundation is laid for the evolution of multicellular organisms with specialized cell types. I observe other endo-symbiotic partnerships forming in parallel with the photosynthetic one. Some hosts engulf bacteria specialized in cellular respiration, organisms that can extract energy from organic compounds with extraordinary efficiency. These respiratory bacteria evolve into mitochondria, the powerhouses of complex cells. Like the photosynthetic endosymbionts, they transfer most of their genes to the host nucleus while retaining their specialized function. The evolution of mitochondria is particularly crucial because it solves the energy problem that limits bacterial complexity. Bacteria can only produce energy at their surfaces, constraining their size and internal organization. But cells with mitochondria can distribute energy production throughout their volume, allowing them to grow much larger and support more complex internal structures. I watch as these early eukaryotic cells, the first organisms to achieve cellular complexity through endosymbiosis, begin to explore new ways of living. Some become mobile predators, using their flexible membranes to engulf and digest other cells. Others remain photosynthetic, but develop the ability to move toward optimal light conditions. Still others learn to form temporary aggregations, the first tentative steps toward multicellularity. The endosymbiotic revolution is not a single event, but a gradual transformation spanning millions of years. Each generation of host and endosymbiont becomes more integrated, more dependent on each other, more capable of sophisticated cellular functions. It's evolution's greatest collaboration, the merger of independent organisms into unified complexity. As I observe these early eukaryotic cells dividing, I witness another innovation crucial for complex life: sexual reproduction. Unlike bacteria, which simply split in two, these cells periodically fuse with others of their kind, combining genetic material before dividing again. This process generates enormous genetic diversity, creating the variation needed for rapid adaptation to changing conditions. The evolution of sex requires sophisticated cellular machinery. The chromosomes must be precisely duplicated and distributed. The nuclear membrane must dissolve and reform. The endosymbionts must be partitioned between daughter cells. It's a complex dance of molecular coordination, one that took millions of years to perfect. Through endosymbiosis, life has achieved something unprecedented: the evolution of cellular complexity through cooperation rather than competition. The eukaryotic cell is not the product of a single organism becoming more complex, but of multiple organisms learning to function as one. It's a biological lesson in the power of partnership, one that will echo through all future evolution. These proto-eukaryotes are rare at first, struggling to compete with the highly optimized bacteria that dominate every niche. But they have advantages. Their internal compartments allow more sophisticated chemistry. They can maintain different conditions in different parts of the cell. Most importantly, they can engulf and digest other cells, a feeding strategy impossible for bacteria with their rigid cell walls. I observe a proto-eukaryote hunting. It approaches a colony of bacteria, extending part of its flexible membrane like a pseudopod. The membrane surrounds several bacterial cells, engulfing them into a food vacuole. Inside, digestive enzymes break down the prey. It's a new way of making a living, predation at the cellular level, and it will change everything. The appearance of cellular predators triggers an arms race in the microbial world. Bacteria that have been comfortable for 1 billion years suddenly face a new threat. Some evolve thicker cell walls or protective sheaths. Others develop toxins to deter predators. Still, others learn to live in colonies too large to engulf. The stable world of the boring billion is developing its first cracks. Climate changes also signal the approaching end of stability. The gradual decline in greenhouse gases, combined with the slowly brightening sun, has created a delicate balance. But now that balance is beginning to tip. I observed the first significant ice formation at the poles in hundreds of millions of years. It's not yet an ice age, just seasonal ice that melts each summer, but it's a sign that the warm stability is ending. The ice has cascading effects. White ice reflects more sunlight than dark water, cooling the poles further. This increases the temperature gradient between equator and poles, driving stronger winds and ocean currents. Weather patterns that have been stable for millions of years begin to shift. Storms become more frequent and intense. In the oceans, the slow rise in oxygen levels finally crosses a critical threshold. At about 3% atmospheric oxygen, new chemical reactions become possible. I observe the formation of an ozone layer. Still thin and patchy, but enough to screen out some ultraviolet radiation. This allows life to venture into previously lethal shallow waters and onto land. The expanding habitable zone drives diversification. Bacteria that were confined to deeper waters can now colonize the surface. Land surfaces that were sterile except for brief periods after rain can now support permanent communities. Each new habitat presents new challenges and opportunities, spurring evolution. I notice changes in the stromatolites that have dominated shallow seas for so long. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, something is eating them. The proto-eukaryotic grazers have evolved the ability to digest cyanobacteria despite their protective sheaths. Stromatolite growth slows as grazing pressure increases. Some reefs that have grown continuously for millions of years stop growing entirely. The disruption of stromatolite communities has far-reaching effects. These structures have been major oxygen producers and carbon fixers. As they decline, the chemical cycles they maintained begin to wobble. Oxygen production becomes more variable. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuate more widely. The stable chemical environment of the boring billion is breaking down. Tectonic changes add to the instability. The supercontinent that has persisted through much of the boring billion is beginning to rift apart. I observe the first cracks appearing. Valleys where the crust is thinning. Volcanic activity increasing. As the continent breaks up, new ocean basins will form, circulation patterns will change, and the stable geography that has persisted for so long will be reorganized. The rifting releases gases long trapped in the mantle. Volcanic eruptions become more frequent and intense, pumping carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. This temporarily reverses the cooling trend, causing wild temperature swings as greenhouse gases spike and then are absorbed by increased weathering of fresh volcanic rocks. Life responds to this instability with innovation. I observe the rapid evolution of new metabolic strategies. Some organisms develop the ability to switch between different metabolisms depending on conditions. Using oxygen when it's available, sulfate when it's not available, it's not. Fermentation as a last resort. This metabolic flexibility allows survival in an increasingly unpredictable world. The proto-eukaryotes undergo rapid diversification. Some become specialized predators, developing structures analogous to mouths for more efficient feeding. Others explore photosynthesis, enslaving cyanobacteria as internal chloroplasts. Still others become decomposers, secreting digestive enzymes to break down organic matter externally. I'm particularly intrigued by the appearance of sexual reproduction among these early eukaryotes. Unlike bacteria, which reproduce by simple division, these cells periodically fuse, mixing their genetic material before dividing. It's inefficient compared to asexual reproduction, but it generates genetic diversity much faster. In an unstable world, diversity is survival. The first multicellular aggregates appear, not true multicellular organisms, but colonies of identical cells that stick together after division. Some form simple filaments, others create sheets or spheres. It's a tentative exploration of multicellularity, still reversible, but hinting at possibilities to come. As I survey the world at the end of the boring billion, I see a planet in transition. The stability that persisted for 1 billion years is breaking down on multiple fronts. Climate is becoming variable. Chemistry is fluctuating. Life is innovating. Continents are rifting. Everything that was solid is becoming fluid. Yet this is not a catastrophe, but a graduation. The boring billion has prepared Earth for this moment. The patient accumulation of oxygen has made new metabolisms possible. The slow evolution of cellular complexity has created organisms capable of exploiting new opportunities. The gradual chemical changes have set the stage for more dramatic transformations. The boring billion was never truly boring. It was a time of preparation, of patient development, of laying foundations. Like a plant growing underground, invisible, but establishing the root system needed for spectacular growth, Earth has been preparing for a new phase of its existence. As I watch the first proto-eukaryote divide by mitosis, its internal structures carefully duplicated and distributed to daughter cells, I realize I'm witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of another. The age of bacteria is not ending. They will continue to dominate Earth's biosphere even in your time, but their monopoly is broken. Complex cells have arrived, and with them the possibility of complex multicellular life. The stromatolites still grow, but more slowly. The purple bacteria still bloom, but in fewer places. The chemical cycles still turn, but less smoothly. The stable world is becoming unstable. The predictable becoming unpredictable. The boring becoming interesting. This is how worlds change. Not all at once, but through the accumulation of small disruptions that eventually cascade into transformation. The boring billion is ending not with a catastrophe, but with a quickening, an acceleration of change that will culminate in the explosion of complex life. As I prepare to return you to your own time, I reflect on what we can learn from the boring billion. It teaches us that stability is not stasis, that patience is not passivity, that preparation is as important as transformation. It shows us that even the quietest periods of history are pregnant with future possibilities. The boring billion reminds us that time operates on scales beyond human comprehension. What seems permanent to us may be merely a phase in planetary evolution. What appears unchanging may be slowly accumulating changes that will eventually transform everything. What looks boring may be the most important preparation for what comes next. In your time, as human civilization rushes through changes at breakneck speed, remember the boring billion. Remember that Earth knows how to be patient, how to prepare, how to lay foundations that will last. Remember that stability has its own value, that repetition can be beautiful, that slowness is not failure but a different kind of success. The boring billion was Earth's masterpiece of patience, its meditation on what it means to be a living planet. For 1 billion years, life explored the possibilities of simplicity, perfected the art of survival, and slowly prepared for complexity. It was not a pause in evolution, but evolution in its most patient mode. When you wake from this journey, remember that you carry within you the legacy of the boring billion. Your cells contain mitochondria that learn to cooperate during this time. Your DNA includes genes first evolved in these ancient seas. Your very existence as a complex multicellular organism was made possible by the patient preparation of this longest of eras. You are a child of Earth's patience, heir to 1 billion years of subtle changes and slow preparation. The stability that seems boring made possible the excitement of complexity. The repetition that seems dull Establish the patterns on which variation could build. The patience that seems endless created the foundation for rapid change. Rest now in the knowledge that Earth knows how to wait, how to prepare, how to build slowly toward transformation. The boring billion was not boring at all. It was the deepest breath Earth ever took, preparing to speak the words of complex life. Until we meet again in the deep rivers of time, I am the Chrononaut, your guide through Earth's memories. Sleep well, child of Earth's patience, heir to the billion-year preparation that made all complexity possible. Rest in the rhythm of the boring billion, the gentle pulse of a planet learning to be alive. As our journey through the boring billion draws to a close, I invite you to carry with you the profound lessons of this longest chapter in Earth's story. You have witnessed the power of patience, the wisdom of repetition, the hidden heroism of preparation. You have seen how the most profound changes can occur in apparent stillness, how the most important work is often invisible, how the greatest achievements require not dramatic gestures, but persistent participation in processes larger than any single existence. The boring billion teaches us that every moment of your life is both insignificant and infinitely meaningful. Insignificant in the context of deep time, where your entire existence is briefer than a bacterial generation, yet infinitely meaningful because you participate, as the bacteria of the boring billion participated, in the ongoing project of consciousness, complexity, and connection that gives purpose to the universe itself. Like the cyanobacteria that spent their brief lives producing the oxygen you now breathe, your own brief existence contributes to processes that extend far beyond your personal timeline. Your thoughts, your relationships, your creative contributions, your acts of love and understanding. These ripple forward through time, part of the continuing story of evolution, consciousness, and cosmic awakening. The bacterial ancestors you have met in this journey live on within you. The mitochondria in your cells are their direct descendants, still carrying out the patient work of energy production that began in the bacterial mats of ancient seas. The oxygen cycles that sustain your life are maintained by photosynthetic organisms using principles perfected during the boring billion. The very ability to think, to feel, to wonder about deep time. These are built upon foundations laid by the patient work of countless bacterial generations. You are not separate from this ancient story, but its continuation. The same patient, persistent creative force that guided bacteria through their billion-year meditation continues to guide the universe toward ever greater complexity and consciousness. You are both the heir to their legacy and the agent of its continuing unfoldment. When you feel impatient with the pace of change in your own life, remember the stromatolites growing layer by microscopic layer over millions of years. When you doubt the value of small, repeated actions, remember the cyanobacteria whose daily photosynthesis gradually transformed the world. When you question whether your brief existence can have lasting significance, remember that the bacteria of the boring billion achieved a kind of immortality, not through individual persistence, but through patient participation in eternal processes. The boring billion was never boring. It was Earth's deepest meditation, its longest preparation, its most patient work. In learning to appreciate this vast span of apparent stillness, you develop the capacity to find meaning in your own quiet moments, significance in your own patient work, beauty in your own participation in the slow but inexorable processes of growth, transformation, and awakening. Rest in the rhythm of the boring billion, the gentle pulse of a planet learning to be alive. Rest in the knowledge that patience is power, that preparation is sacred work, that the quiet moments are often the most transformative. Rest in the deep time perspective that reveals your brief life as both temporary and eternal. Temporary in its individual form, but eternal in its participation in the continuing story of complexity, consciousness, and cosmic evolution. The boring billion reminds us that we are all children of deep time, heirs to the patient work of countless ancestors, participants in projects that began long before our birth, and will continue long after our death. In remembering this, we find both humility and significance, both perspective and purpose. Sleep now, child of the stars, heir to the bacterial wisdom, participant in the eternal dance of becoming. Dream in the deep rhythms of geological time, where every breath connects you to the ancient seas. Every heartbeat echoes the patient pulse of bacterial communities. Every moment of consciousness carries forward the billion-year project of life learning to know itself. The boring billion was Earth's gift to the future. A billion years of patient preparation that made complexity possible. Your life, too, is a gift to the future. A brief but meaningful contribution to the continuing story of consciousness, creativity, and connection. Rest in this knowledge. Rest in this rhythm. Rest in the eternal return of patience, preparation, and transformation that defines the deepest meaning of existence itself. Rest. In the deep time that connects all moments, in the patient rhythm that underlies all change, in the eternal story of which you are both author and character, rest. The boring billion continues within you, its wisdom alive in your cells, its patience available in your breath, its promise of transformation unfolding in your dreams. Rest.